Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. David Holloway's satellite phone buzzed at 3:47 p.m. on December 18, 2015, and the first thing he heard was his daughter screaming, "Dad! Dad, please! Something's wrong with Marcus. He won't stop, he's..." Static swallowed her voice. David was already moving, grabbing his parka from the hook by the door of the Kantishna ranger station. His hands shaking so badly, he nearly dropped the phone. Outside, the temperature had been holding at minus 38 degrees for 6 hours, and the sun had set 40 minutes ago. It wouldn't rise again for another 19 hours. Sarah, where are you?" He was shouting into the phone, not caring that Rangers Mitchell and Chen were staring at him from across the room. "Give me your position." More static. Then Sarah's voice came back, thinner now, terrified. "We're at the old mining camp, the one near..." A sound cut through the line that made David's stomach drop. It was a shriek, high-pitched and inhuman, like wind through ice caves, except there was intelligence in it, purpose, and underneath, a wet, tearing sound. "Sarah! Eating him, oh God, Dad, he's eating..." The line went dead. David stared at the phone for 3 seconds that felt like hours. His daughter was 17 years old. She was supposed to be on a supervised winter camping trip with Marcus Way, another ranger's son, and Tom Patterson, a volunteer wilderness guide who'd been leading youth expeditions in Denali for 15 years. They'd left the station 4 days ago for a carefully planned route through the Kantishna wilderness, easy terrain, well within protocol, the kind of trip David had led dozens of times himself during his 22 years as a senior ranger. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Mitchell, get the SAR team mobilized now," David said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Chen, contact park operations. I need the coordinates for Patterson's emergency beacon." But even as he said it, he was pulling up the tracking data on the computer, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency through the National Park Service satellite monitoring system. Tom Patterson's Garmin InReach should have been transmitting every 10 minutes. David found the data stream and felt ice form in his chest. The last transmission had been 37 hours ago, from a position near the abandoned Kantishna Hills mining camp, elevation 2,190 feet, approximately 43 miles northwest of the station. Since then, nothing. Either the device had failed, unlikely the InReach was designed to operate in extreme conditions, or someone had turned it off, or destroyed it. David zoomed in on the topographic map. The mining camp had been abandoned since the 1980s, a relic of the brief gold rush that had brought desperate men into the Alaskan wilderness before the claims ran dry. There were old structures still standing, but the area was officially off limits, too unstable for visitors. Why would Tom have taken the kids there? "I'm going," David said. Mitchell, a stocky woman in her 40s with 30 years of mountain rescue experience, looked at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "Dave, it's minus 40 out there and dropping. We've got a storm front moving in from the northwest. Even with snowmobiles, you're looking at 6 hours minimum to reach that position. And that's if the weather holds. My daughter just called me screaming about someone eating someone. I'm going. Then we go as a team, full SAR protocol. Give me 30 minutes to..." "I don't have 30 minutes." David was already pulling his gear from his locker, the expedition parka rated to minus 60, the heavy bib pants, the boots with chemical heating elements. Sarah sounded terrified. "If there's been an accident, if someone's injured..." "If there's been an accident, rushing in alone in the dark doesn't help anyone," Mitchell said, but her tone had softened. She had kids too. "Dave, I know what you're feeling, but you're not thinking clearly. Let me get Chen and Harper. We'll take 2 machines, travel in pairs, standard cold weather protocol. That's 45 minutes max." David wanted to argue, but the rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 2 decades of Alaskan wilderness work, knew she was right. Solo travel in these conditions was suicide. If his snowmobile broke down, if he hit unseen ice, if he made one mistake, he'd be dead in less than an hour. 45 minutes, he said, not 1 second longer. They made it in 38. Mitchell and Chen took the lead snowmobile, a ski-doo expedition with emergency rescue gear, and a survival sled attached. David and Harper, a quiet Inupiaq ranger who'd grown up in the interior, followed on a second machine. The headlights carved tunnels through absolute darkness, and the cold was so intense it felt like being repeatedly punched in the face even through the balaclava and goggles. David's breath formed instant ice crystals that pattered against his hood like tiny stones. The trip that should have taken 6 hours took 9. They hit the storm front at hour 3. Wind that screamed across the tundra at 40 miles per hour, driving snow so thick they had to slow to walking speed to avoid running blind into obstacles. Twice they had to stop to dig the machines out of drifts. Once Harper spotted a moose in their path seconds before impact, and they detoured a quarter-mile around the animal, because hitting a 1,000-pound moose at 20 miles per hour would have killed them all. By the time they reached the mining camp, it was past midnight. David's face was numb despite the chemical warmers in his hood, and his fingers felt like frozen sausages inside his gloves. But the fear for Sarah had burned constant through the entire trip, keeping him alert, keeping him focused. The camp appeared as darker shadows against the snow. 3 collapsed structures and 1 building still partially standing, a bunkhouse with most of its roof intact. Their headlights reflected off something metallic near the largest ruin. As they got closer, David saw it was a snowmobile, a newer model similar to theirs. "That's Patterson's machine," Harper said quietly. They stopped 30 yards away and killed the engines. The silence that followed was overwhelming, broken only by the wind. David pulled his mag light from his belt and swept the beam across the camp. Snow had drifted against the buildings, creating smooth white curves that looked almost beautiful. Nothing moved. "Sarah." David's voice was swallowed by the wind almost immediately. "Tom. Marcus." No response. Mitchell had her radio out, trying different channels. "Kantishna SR to Patterson, do you copy? Kantishna SR to any member of the Patterson group. Please respond." Static. Then, faintly, something that might have been a voice or might have been interference. "We need to search the structures," David said, already moving toward the standing bunkhouse. Mitchell grabbed his arm. "Protocol, Dave. We stick together, we document everything, and we stay alert." She was right, but every second felt like hours. They approached the bunkhouse in a line, lights sweeping the area. The door hung open, snow piled inside the entrance. David's light caught something dark on the door frame. Not rust, too organic. He leaned closer. It was a handprint, frozen in blood. "Jesus," Chen whispered. David pushed past him and into the bunkhouse. The interior was a single large room, maybe 40 feet long, lined with rotted bunk frames. At the far end was a potbelly stove, and next to it were camping supplies, 2 modern tents still in their stuff sacks, sleeping bags, a camp stove, freeze-dried food packets. Tom Patterson's gear, identifiable by the distinctive orange dry bags he always used, but no people. David moved deeper into the room, his breath pluming in the flashlight beam. There were tracks in the snow and dust on the floor, lots of them, overlapping, confused. Signs of recent occupation, and then his light caught something that made him stop. In the center of the room was a circle drawn in what looked like ash or charcoal. Inside the circle were symbols, geometric patterns, spirals, shapes that might have been letters in a language David didn't recognize. And at the center of the circle was a pile of bones. Not animal bones. The size and shape were wrong. Human finger bones, arranged in a careful spiral. "What the hell is this?" Mitchell's voice was tight. David forced himself to look away from the bones and scan the rest of the room. There were marks on the walls, scratches, deep gouges in the old wood, and words, carved or written in something dark. "Hungry, hungry, hungry," repeated dozens of times, the letters getting larger and more frantic. "Dave, look at this!" Harper was crouched by one of the bunk frames, examining something. David joined him and felt his throat constrict. It was Sarah's jacket. Her bright blue North Face parka, the one he'd helped her pick out 3 months ago. There was blood on it, frozen solid, spreading from a tear in the shoulder. Not a lot of blood, but enough. Sarah! David was moving before he'd consciously decided to, running toward the back of the bunkhouse where a doorway led deeper into the structure. Mitchell was shouting behind him, but he didn't care. Couldn't care. His daughter's jacket had blood on it, and she was here somewhere. Had to be here. The back room was smaller, darker. His flashlight beam swept across more bunks, more debris, and then he saw her. Sarah was huddled in the far corner, wedged into the space where 2 walls met. She was alive. He could see her breath pluming in the cold. But she wasn't moving. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing, and she was shaking so violently her teeth rattled. Sarah, sweetheart, it's Dad. David was beside her in seconds, pulling off his gloves to touch her face. Her skin was ice cold, far too cold. Hypothermia, severe. He needed to get her warm immediately. I've got you. You're safe. I'm here. She didn't respond, didn't even seem to see him. He started to lift her, and she suddenly came to life, thrashing, screaming. No, don't take me outside. He's out there. Marcus is out there. Sarah, it's me. It's Dad. You're safe. You don't understand. She grabbed his parka with frozen fingers, her eyes wild. Marcus ate Tom. He ate him. We were running out of food and Tom fell through the ice and broke his leg and we couldn't get him out. And Marcus said we had to do something or we'd all die, and then... She dissolved into sobs that racked her whole body. Mitchell was there with the emergency thermal blanket, wrapping it around Sarah's shoulders. Chen was on the radio calling for medical evacuation. David held his daughter and tried to process what she'd said. Marcus ate Tom. That was impossible. People didn't just... But he remembered the scream on the phone, the wet, tearing sound. Where's Marcus now? David asked gently. Sarah's eyes focused on him for the first time. He changed. After he ate, he changed, got taller. His face got longer. His eyes... She shuddered. His eyes were wrong. Like he was hungry even though he'd just eaten. Like he'd always be hungry. And he left. Went out into the snow. But I could hear him circling the camp, calling my name. He wanted me to come out. David looked at Mitchell, who looked back with an expression that said she was thinking the same thing he was. Severe hypothermia could cause hallucinations, psychotic breaks. Sarah had been out here in brutal cold for at least 30 hours since the last beacon transmission. She'd witnessed something traumatic. Maybe Tom Patterson had died from his injuries. Maybe there'd been an accident with the food supplies. The human mind under extreme stress created narratives to explain the unexplainable. But then Harper spoke from the doorway, his voice carefully neutral. Dave, you need to see this. Outside, the storm had temporarily lessened, and in the beam of Harper's flashlight they could see tracks in the snow. They started from the bunkhouse and led away into the darkness. The tracks were roughly human-shaped, 2 legs, bipedal gait, but they were enormous. Each footprint was at least 18 inches long, and the stride length was over 7 feet. That's not possible, Chen said. No human has feet that big. And look at the depth, Harper said, kneeling by one of the prints. Whatever made these weighs at least 300 pounds, maybe more. David stared at the tracks. They were fresh. The wind hadn't filled them in yet. Whatever had made them had been here recently. Maybe was still here. Mitchell, get Sarah stabilized for transport. Chen, stay with them. Harper, you're with me. Dave, what are you doing? Tom Patterson is still out here somewhere. Dead or alive, we're not leaving him. Mitchell started to protest, but David was already following the tracks, his mag light in one hand and his radio in the other. Harper caught up to him quickly, carrying the rifle they kept for bear encounters. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. Those tracks didn't look like a bear's. The trail led northeast from the camp, into an area of broken terrain where permafrost heaves had created a maze of pressure ridges and ice formations. The wind had picked up again, driving snow into their faces. David's exposed skin felt like it was being scraped with razor blades, but he kept moving. After 20 minutes, Harper grabbed his arm and pointed. Ahead, barely visible in the swirling snow, was a shape. David approached slowly, his light steady. It was Tom Patterson, or what was left of him. The body lay sprawled in the snow, frozen solid. The left leg was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle below the knee, but that wasn't what had killed him. Tom's chest cavity had been opened, the ribs spread apart like grasping fingers. Inside was nothing. The organs were gone, consumed. The face was intact, but the expression was one of absolute terror, mouth open in a silent scream. Jesus Christ, Harper whispered. David fought down nausea and forced himself to examine the scene professionally. Tom had been dead for at least 24 hours, maybe longer. The wounds were consistent with, what? An animal attack? But what kind of animal ate selectively, taking only the organs? And the ribs had been broken from the inside out, as if something had been trying to get out rather than in. No, that wasn't right. He was seeing this wrong, letting Sarah's traumatized account color his perception. Tom had died from the broken leg, from hypothermia and shock. The wounds were post-mortem, from scavengers, except there were no other tracks around the body. Just the enormous footprints leading away to the north. Harper, help me document this. We'll need photos for the investigation. But Harper wasn't listening. He was staring past David, his face gone slack. What the hell is that? David turned. About 50 yards away, standing at the top of a pressure ridge, was a figure. In the darkness and snow, it was hard to make out details, but it was tall, impossibly tall, at least 9 feet. The proportions were wrong, the torso too long, the limbs too thin. As David's flashlight beam touched it, the thing turned its head with a movement that was too fast, too fluid. David saw its face for just a second. It might have been human once. The features were still recognizable, eyes, nose, mouth, but everything was stretched, distorted, the skin pulled tight over a skull that was too large. The mouth opened, and there were too many teeth, all of them sharp. And it was smiling. Run, Harper said quietly. The thing on the ridge made a sound. It started as a whisper, like wind through dead trees, but grew into a shriek that seemed to bypass David's ears and resonate directly in his bones. The sound was hunger given voice, emptiness that could never be filled. They ran. David's training said to never run from predators, but his instincts screamed that this wasn't a predator. It was something else, something worse. They crashed through the snow back toward the camp, and behind them that terrible shriek sounded again, closer. Harper was slightly ahead, the rifle clutched in his hands. He risked a glance back, and his eyes widened. It's gaining! David didn't look. He just ran, his lungs burning in the frozen air, his legs pumping. The camp lights were visible ahead, maybe 200 yards. They could make it. They had to make it. Harper screamed. David spun, bringing his flashlight around. The thing had caught Harper, impossibly fast despite its size. It held him with one massive hand wrapped around his chest, lifted him off the ground. Harper was firing the rifle point blank into the thing's torso, but the bullet seemed to have no effect. The thing leaned its head down, opened that too wide mouth, and bit into Harper's shoulder. The crunch of bone breaking was sickeningly clear even over the wind. David's radio was in his hand without conscious thought. Mitchell, we need immediate evacuation. We're under attack. Harper's down. Then he did something stupid, something he'd never recommend to any ranger under any circumstances. He charged the thing. He didn't have a weapon, didn't have a plan. He just knew that Harper was dying, and Sarah was back at that camp, and he was not going to let this thing, whatever it was, reach his daughter. He slammed into the creature at full speed, using his weight and momentum. It was like hitting a tree. The impact should have knocked him back, but he kept pushing, kept driving forward. The thing dropped Harper and turned its attention to David. Up close, the smell was overwhelming. Rotted meat and decay mixed with something else, something chemical and wrong. The face looming over him had Marcus Way's features, distorted and stretched. The eyes were the worst part. They were aware, intelligent, and absolutely empty at the same time. "Mr. Holloway," it rasped, the voice barely human. "Hungry, so hungry." "Marcus?" David barely recognized his own voice. Was Marcus, ate Tom, became this. The thing's hand closed around David's arm, the grip crushingly strong. Can't stop. The hunger never stops. Need to feed. Need to... Gunfire erupted from behind them. Mitchell had arrived with Chen, both of them unloading their sidearms into the creature. It shrieked again and released David, staggering back. But the bullets didn't stop it. They punched through the torso, leaving visible holes, but no blood came out. The thing looked down at its own wounds with something like curiosity, then turned and ran into the darkness with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. David crawled to Harper. The ranger was still alive, but barely, his breath coming in wet gasps. The shoulder wound was catastrophic, bone visible, tissue torn. They got him onto the transport sled, Mitchell working to stabilize him while Chen called for emergency evacuation. "What the fuck was that?" Chen kept saying. "What the fuck, what the fuck? Get it together," Mitchell snapped, but her hands were shaking too. Back at the bunkhouse, Sarah was where they'd left her, wrapped in the thermal blanket. When she saw David, she started crying again. I told you he changed." David held her, and for the first time in his professional career, he had no rational explanation to offer. He'd seen something that shouldn't exist. Marcus Way, 17 years old, honor student, varsity soccer player, had eaten human flesh and become something else, something that shouldn't be possible. But he'd seen it. The storm intensified, making evacuation impossible. They were trapped at the mining camp with a wounded ranger, a traumatized teenager, and something hunting in the darkness outside. Mitchell set up a defensive perimeter with the emergency flares, and they barricaded themselves in the bunkhouse. Harper was unconscious now, his breathing shallow. They'd done what they could with the medical kit, but he needed a hospital, and they were 40 miles from the nearest road. David sat with Sarah, who'd finally stopped shaking but still wouldn't close her eyes. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly. "From the beginning." Sarah's voice was small, exhausted. "We were fine the first 2 days. Everything was perfect. Tom was showing us winter survival techniques, how to read the landscape. Then on the 3rd day, Tom fell through hidden ice near the river. His leg broke. We heard it snap. We got him out, but the bone was through the skin. He couldn't walk." She paused, swallowing hard. "Tom said we had to leave him, that Marcus and I should go for help, but Marcus got weird. He kept looking at Tom like he was food. And Tom kept saying he was going to die anyway, that we should save ourselves. That night, Tom developed a fever, started talking out of his head. And Marcus, he said we were running low on food, said the old miners who worked these camps used to do things when they ran out of supplies." David felt sick. "Sarah." "I fell asleep. When I woke up, Marcus was crouched over Tom, and there was blood, and..." Her voice broke. "Tom was already dead. The fever killed him. But Marcus, he said we couldn't waste it. He said it was the only way we'd survive long enough for rescue. And he ate. Just started eating. And I ran. I locked myself in the back room, and I heard him out here, chanting something, drawing those symbols. And then he screamed. And when I looked out, he wasn't Marcus anymore, the Wendigo." The word came to David from somewhere in his memory, a folklore class he'd taken decades ago as part of his forestry degree. Indigenous peoples of the northern forests had legends about winter cannibalism, about what happened to those who consumed human flesh. The Wendigo was a spirit of insatiable hunger that possessed those who broke the ultimate taboo. Once transformed, they could never be satisfied, never be full. They became monsters, driven to hunt and feed forever. He'd thought it was just stories, cautionary tales to prevent cannibalism during harsh winters. But he'd seen Marcus, seen what he'd become. "There's an old story," Chen said from across the room. "He was Athabascan, raised in the interior. My grandmother used to tell it. About the Wendigo, that's what her people called it. She said it was real. Said her grandfather had seen one, up near the Yukon border. Said once someone ate human flesh, the hunger spirit entered them and they stopped being human. They became something that looked like a person but wasn't anymore. How do you stop it? Mitchell asked. You can't. Not really. The only way is to burn the heart. But you have to catch it first, and once they transform, they're fast and strong. Almost impossible to kill. David thought about Marcus, about a 17-year-old boy who'd made a terrible decision in desperation and had become something monstrous. Tom Patterson had been dead already. Marcus hadn't murdered him. But he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He's going to come back, Sarah whispered. He wants to finish. Wants to eat the rest. She was right. David could feel it. A certainty that had nothing to do with reason. The thing that had been Marcus' way was out there in the storm, and it would return. The hunger would drive it back. They spent the next 3 hours preparing. Mitchell and Chen secured the bunkhouse as best they could, nailing boards over the broken windows. David gathered anything that could burn: old furniture, broken bunks, papers from the mining operation. If Chen's grandmother was right, fire was their only weapon. Harper regained consciousness around 4 a.m., delirious and babbling about teeth and hunger. They gave him morphine from the medical kit, but David wasn't sure if he'd make it through the night even if they weren't under siege. The attack came at 4:47 a.m. The door exploded inward with a crack of splintering wood. The thing that had been Marcus' way stood in the doorway, snow swirling around it. It was bigger now, David realized. It had grown since the last encounter, fed on Harper's blood and become more. The skin had gone gray-white, the color of fresh snow. The eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting their flashlight beams like an animal's. Hungry? It said, the word barely recognizable through a mouth that was mostly teeth. Never. Full. Need. More. Mitchell and Chen opened fire, their shots carefully aimed. David saw bullets punch through the creature's chest, saw the impact stagger it backward. But it kept coming, reaching for them with those two long arms. David grabbed a burning brand from the fire they'd built in the old potbelly stove and swung it at the thing's face. The creature flinched back. Fire clearly affected it in ways bullets didn't. It shrieked that terrible sound again and retreated through the broken door. But it didn't leave. They could hear it circling the building, scratching at the walls, testing for weak points. Every few minutes it would make a rush at the door or try to force its way through a window, and each time they'd drive it back with fire. We can't keep this up, Mitchell said, her voice rough from smoke. We're running out of things to burn. David looked at Sarah huddled in the corner and made a decision. We need to end this. Draw it in and finish it. How? The symbols. The ones Marcus drew. Sarah said he was chanting something when he transformed. Maybe it works in reverse. It was desperate, probably stupid, and based on folklore rather than any rational plan. But rationale had stopped applying the moment a teenage boy had become a 9-foot monster. They found Marcus Way's journal in one of the orange dry bags. The last entries were increasingly frantic, documenting Tom's injury, the dwindling food supplies, the impossible decision. And on the final pages were sketches, the same symbols David had seen on the floor, along with words in what looked like Cree syllabary. Marcus had researched this. Somehow, he'd known what was going to happen to him. The final entry was just one sentence. I'm sorry. I was so hungry. Using the journal as a guide, David redrew the symbols on the floor, exactly as Marcus had made them. Then he did something that went against every instinct. He opened the door. The Wendigo was waiting. It looked at David with those empty, glowing eyes, and for just a second, David saw Marcus Way underneath. The boy who'd been scared and desperate, and had made a choice he couldn't take back. Marcus, if you're still in there, I need you to listen. Come inside. Let us help you. The thing tilted its head, considering. Then it stepped through the doorway, ducking beneath the frame. It was so tall its head nearly touched the ceiling. The stench of decay rolled off it in waves. Hungry, it whispered. Please, make it stop. It was still Marcus. Part of him was still aware, still trapped inside this thing he'd become, still suffering. David led it to the circle, the symbols. "Stand here." The Wendigo looked down at the markings and something like recognition flickered in its eyes. "This won't kill me. Nothing kills Wendigo. Only fire." "I know," David said quietly. He was holding the largest burning brand, the one they'd been saving. "Marcus, I need you to understand. You're going to stay standing. You're not going to fight this, okay?" The thing that had been a teenage boy nodded slowly. Then it stepped into the circle. Chen began reading the words from the journal, the Cree syllables sounding strange and ancient in the abandoned mining camp. The Wendigo stood motionless, its body beginning to tremble. The two long limbs started to contract, the distorted features shifting. But the hunger was too strong. The transformation had gone too far. The Wendigo's eyes snapped fully open and it lunged toward Sarah with a speed that made it blur. David didn't think. He drove the burning brand straight into the creature's chest, felt it pierce through the gray skin, felt the heat of the flame spread. The Wendigo shrieked and grabbed David, lifting him off the ground. Its claws punctured his parka, broke through skin. Then Mitchell was there with the camp stove, emptied of propane and now filled with gasoline. She threw it at the Wendigo's feet and Chen lit it with a flare gun. The flames spread instantly, engulfing the creature. It dropped David and staggered backward, its shrieks becoming almost human again. For just a moment, David saw Marcus Way's face, terrified and relieved at the same time. Then the fire consumed it entirely, the body collapsing into ash with impossible speed. The Wendigo burned hotter than normal fire, as if its very existence was fuel. Within minutes, there was nothing left but blackened bones and ash. David stared at the remains of Marcus Way, 17 years old, and thought about hunger, how it could drive people to terrible choices, how it could transform them into something unrecognizable. The storm finally broke at dawn. Medical evacuation arrived 2 hours later. Helicopters from Fort Wainwright, equipped for extreme cold rescue. They airlifted Harper first, still clinging to life. Then Sarah, wrapped in blankets, sedated to help with the trauma. David was the last to leave. Before boarding the helicopter, he looked back at the mining camp one final time. The bunkhouse stood silent in the snow, its interior blackened by fire. Inside, Tom Patterson's bones waited for recovery, and scattered throughout the circle, the ashes of Marcus Way would freeze and eventually be buried by spring snows. The official report stated that Tom Patterson had died from complications of a compound fracture, sustained in a fall through ice. Marcus Way had succumbed to hypothermia while attempting to seek help, his body discovered 1.3 miles from the camp. The symbols in the bunkhouse were attributed to psychological breakdown under extreme stress. Harper survived but retired from the Park Service 6 months later, unwilling to talk about what had happened. Sarah went through counseling, eventually returning to school. She never spoke publicly about the events at the mining camp. But sometimes David would catch her staring out windows at winter landscapes, and he knew she was remembering the thing that had been Marcus, remembering the hunger that had transformed a desperate boy into a monster. David himself kept working at Denali, but something had changed. He found himself researching the history of the region more carefully now, looking at old records from the mining days. He discovered 7 documented cases of cannibalism in the Kantishna area between 1905 and 1948, all during particularly harsh winters when prospectors had been trapped without supplies. And in each case there were follow-up reports of disappearances, of something hunting in the wilderness. He thought about Chen's grandmother, about indigenous knowledge that had been dismissed as superstition by people like himself. The Wendigo was real. It had always been real, a consequence of breaking the fundamental law of humanity. The hunger didn't discriminate. It took anyone who crossed that line, transformed them into something that could never be satisfied. On especially cold nights when the temperature dropped below -40 and the darkness pressed close, David would stand outside the ranger station and listen to the wind. Sometimes he thought he could hear something else beneath the wind, a whisper, a voice, begging to be fed. He'd think about Marcus Way and wonder if destroying the body had truly ended it, or if some part of the hunger spirit survived, waiting for the next desperate soul to make the same terrible choice. The Kantishna mining camp was officially closed after the incident, added to the National Park Service's list of hazardous historic sites. But the designation did nothing to stop what lived there. David knew that, just as he knew that somewhere in those 6 million acres of Alaskan wilderness, other transformations had occurred. Other people had crossed the line and become something else. Hunger was eternal. And in the endless winter darkness, it was always waiting. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Christopher Wade had been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 14 years, and in that time he'd learned that the Hoh rainforest didn't give up its secrets easily. The dense canopy absorbed sound the way moss absorbed moisture, creating pockets of silence so complete they felt manufactured. Standing at the trailhead where Amanda Pierce's Honda Civic sat gathering condensation, Chris felt that silence pressing against his eardrums like water at depth. The car had been there for 4 days. The university had called on day 3. Chris circled the vehicle, noting details with the methodical precision that had earned him a reputation as the ranger you wanted on a search operation. No broken windows, doors locked, a parking permit properly displayed on the dash dated October 12, 2009. Inside he could see a North Face jacket wadded on the passenger seat, a travel mug in the cup holder, and a stack of field guides rubber-banded together. The mycology texts were visible even through the rain-streaked glass. His Garmin eTrex GPS unit showed Amanda's filed itinerary. Hoh River Trail to the Seven Lakes Basin Research Area, elevation gain of 3,900 feet over 8 miles. Standard route for researchers studying fungal biodiversity in old-growth ecosystems. She'd had a permit for 7 days of backcountry camping. She should have checked in via the emergency radio at the ranger station 3 days ago. Chris keyed his Motorola handheld. Base, this is Wade. I'm at the Hoh Trailhead beginning track to Pierce's research site. Vehicle confirms subject presence. Starting ascent at 0900 hours. The response crackled through Douglas fir interference. Copy that, Wade. Weather service shows front moving in by 1400. You've got maybe 4 hours of good visibility. Understood. Chris clipped the radio to his belt and shouldered his pack. 60 pounds of search and rescue equipment, medical supplies, and enough food for 3 days if the operation extended. His boots found the familiar trail, and the forest swallowed him within 20 yards. The Hoh rainforest received an average of 140 inches of rain annually, creating a primordial ecosystem that looked as if it had existed unchanged since the Pleistocene. Sitka spruce rose like cathedral columns, their trunks wrapped in club moss that glowed an almost luminescent green. Nurse logs the size of small houses decomposed in slow motion, hosting entire ecosystems on their rotting backs. Everything dripped, everything grew. The air itself felt alive with moisture and spores. Chris had always found comfort in the rationality of this environment. The forest operated on principles he understood: hydrology, nutrient cycling, succession ecology, cause and effect, observable phenomena. His degree in wildlife biology from Oregon State had taught him to see forests as systems, not mysteries. When tourists claimed to feel presences or energies in old-growth areas, Chris attributed it to infrasound from wind through massive trees, or the disorienting effect of fractal patterns in the canopy. There were always explanations. He made good time despite the trail conditions. His legs knew the rhythm of switchbacks. His lungs had adapted to the elevation over years. At mile marker 4, he stopped to check his GPS coordinates against Amanda's filed route. She'd been methodical in her planning. He appreciated that. The permit application showed exact waypoints, estimated arrival times, even her research methodology. She was studying Armillaria ostoyi distribution patterns, the honey mushroom that could form organisms covering acres underground. Logical, scientific, the kind of person who wouldn't panic in the wilderness, which made her disappearance more concerning. At 2,300 feet elevation, Chris found Amanda's first research marker, fluorescent flagging tape tied to a western hemlock with a numbered tag matching her permit. He photographed it with his digital camera, noting the GPS coordinates in his weatherproof notebook. The marker looked fresh, properly secured. Amanda had made it this far without incident, but something felt wrong with the forest around the marker. Chris stopped, testing the sensation. His analytical mind immediately began cataloging variables: barometric pressure dropping ahead of the front, wind direction shifting from southwest to north, ambient temperature cooling. All normal. Yet the quality of silence had changed. The Ho was never truly quiet. There should be birdsong, the rustle of Roosevelt elk moving through understory, the percussion of water dripping from leaf to leaf. Instead, he heard only his own breathing and the creak of his pack's frame. He continued upward. Mile 5. Mile 6. More research markers, each one properly placed and documented. At mile 7, the trail narrowed to a primitive track that only backcountry researchers and serious backpackers used. The forest closed in, pressing against the path like something with intent. Chris checked his watch. 12:47. He'd made excellent time. Amanda's research camp should be another quarter-mile ahead, near the junction where Bogachiel Creek fed into the Sol Duc drainage. He could smell water in the air, that mineral scent of glacier-fed streams over bedrock. The camp came into view through a gap in the sword ferns. Chris's forward motion stopped as if he'd hit a physical barrier. Amanda Pierce's research station occupied a small clearing beside the creek, and every piece of equipment was still there. The north face tent stood properly staked, rain fly secured against weather. A titanium cookpot sat on a portable stove, and when Chris approached close enough to look inside, he saw the remnants of instant oatmeal crusted to the bottom. His fingers hovered over the pot's exterior, not quite warm, but not fully cold either. Ambient temperature, but the consistency of the food suggested it had been made within the last 48 hours. The portable weather station she'd set up continued to record data, its small screen displaying temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure readings. A digital audio recorder sat on a flat rock, its LED still blinking red. Recording. Chris pressed the stop button and the display showed 37 hours of continuous audio captured. Amanda's field notebook lay open beside the recorder, protected from rain by a Ziploc bag. The last entry was dated October 14th, 2 days ago. Day 3. Remarkable Armillaria ostoyae fruiting density near confluence. Counted 47 distinct honey mushroom clusters within 20-meter radius. Root systems connecting at least 15 trees. Collected samples A47 through A63. Temperature dropped 15 degrees in last hour, unusual for this system. No weather front showing on portable unit. Localized phenomenon, hearing odd acoustic patterns. Creek sounds wrong, like multiple water sources at different distances, but GPS confirms only one stream within 400 meters. Possible canyon echo effect, though topography doesn't support it. Saw something in peripheral vision 3 times today. White fabric? Lost trail marker? Gone when I turned to look directly. Eye fatigue from microscope work. Very cold now. Can see breath despite outside temp showing 52 degree bars. Instrument malfunction. The entry ended there. Mid-analysis. No sign-off. No evening notes about dinner or plans for the next day. Chris photographed every page of the notebook, then turned his attention to the tent. The zipper was closed, but not locked. Inside, Amanda's sleeping bag lay unzipped and pushed to one side, as if she'd gotten out of it quickly. Her phone, a basic Samsung flip model, sat on top of the bag, showing 3% battery and no signal. That tracked. Cellular coverage in the Sol Duc drainage was essentially non-existent. Her pack remained organized, contents neatly arranged. First aid kit, water filter, 7 days of freeze-dried meals with only 2 consumed extra batteries, waterproof matches. Nothing missing that Chris could identify. No sign of struggle, no evidence of wildlife intrusion, no indication she'd packed up to leave. It was as if Amanda Pierce had simply stood up and walked into the forest. Chris stepped back from the tent and turned in a slow circle, using his professional eye to read the scene. Standard protocol suggested animal attack or medical emergency as primary scenarios, but he saw no blood, no torn fabric, no scattered equipment from a panicked flight. The creek burbled 15 feet away. No signs of someone falling in, no drag marks on the muddy bank. His radio crackled. "Wade, this is base. Weather front arriving ahead of schedule. You've got maybe 30 minutes before visibility drops to nothing. Status?" Chris keyed the transmit button. "I found Pierce's camp. Subject is not present. Equipment intact, no signs of struggle or wildlife encounter. Site appears abandoned mid-activity. I'm going to do a preliminary radius search before..." The radio emitted a shriek of static so intense Chris ripped it away from his ear. When the noise stopped, the channel was dead. He checked the battery indicator, full charge. He tried different channels. Nothing but silence. The radio's LED display flickered once, then died completely. Chris stood in the clearing with a dead radio, and thickening clouds cutting the already dim light to something like deep dusk, though his watch insisted it was only 1:23 in the afternoon. The forest silence had returned, but now it felt less like absence and more like held breath. He pulled out his GPS unit. The screen showed his position, but the elevation reading was fluctuating wildly. 2,147 feet, then 3,112 feet, then 1,994 feet. Despite the fact that he hadn't moved, the satellite connection indicator blinked amber, struggling for fix. Standard protocol in equipment failure was to mark position and return to the trailhead for backup. Chris had enough experience to know that solo search operations in deteriorating weather were how rangers became statistics, but something about the scene held him. Not intuition. Chris didn't trust intuition, but observable anomalies that didn't fit his mental models of how missing person scenarios developed. He made a decision that would later seem foolish. He would conduct a standard spiral search pattern radiating from the camp, 100 meters in each cardinal direction. 30 minutes, maximum. Mark any findings, photograph everything, then descend before the weather closed in completely. Chris started with north, following his compass, bearing into the forest. The understory here was relatively open beneath the massive Sitka spruce canopy, allowing him to maintain visual contact with his backtrack. At 50 meters, he found another of Amanda's research markers, this one with a fresh notation in silver Sharpie. A64, abnormal growth pattern, cold pocket. The flagging tape stirred in wind that Chris couldn't feel. He continued to the 100-meter mark, finding nothing else, then returned to camp and set out east. The forest in this direction grew denser, western red cedar mixing with the spruce, creating a claustrophobic tangle of branches that dripped with club moss. The light, already dim, took on a greenish quality, filtered through layer upon layer of moisture-heavy vegetation. At 70 meters, Chris stopped. Hanging from a low branch directly in his path was a piece of white cloth. Not trail marking. Not any kind of fabric that belonged in the backcountry. Chris approached slowly, his mind already working through explanations. Lost bandana, torn shirt caught on a snag, litter from an inconsiderate hiker. But as he got closer, the fabric revealed itself as something else entirely. It was a strip of white cotton, about 4 feet long and 8 inches wide, tied carefully to the branch in a way that allowed it to hang vertically. The fabric was clean, impossibly clean given the forest's constant moisture and the debris that should have accumulated on any hanging material, and it was cold. Chris reached out to touch it and jerked his hand back. The fabric radiated cold like metal left overnight in a freezer, so intense he could feel it from inches away. He photographed it from multiple angles, noting the GPS coordinates, even though his unit was still malfunctioning. The fabric moved again, rippling in that unfelt wind, and Chris noticed something he'd missed. There was writing on it. Characters. Not English. The ink looked recent, black against white, forming symbols that Chris's rational mind categorized as Asian, probably Japanese, though he couldn't read them. The characters were precise, written with clear intent, and they covered the entire length of fabric in vertical columns. Chris's heart rate had increased. He registered this clinically, noting the physiological response: elevated pulse, slight tremor in his hands, heightened sensory awareness. Adrenaline, the body's response to perceived threat, even when the conscious mind insisted there was nothing threatening about a piece of fabric in the woods. He pulled out his digital camera and zoomed in on the characters, taking high-resolution shots for later analysis. As he lowered the camera, movement registered in his peripheral vision, something white, about 30 meters deeper into the forest. Chris turned his head sharply. Nothing, just cedar trunks and the green gloom between them. He took 3 steps toward where he'd seen the movement. A branch cracked behind him. Chris spun. The clearing where Amanda's camp sat was barely visible through the trees, maybe 60 meters distant. Had he come that far from his search bearing? His compass showed him facing south-southwest when he should have been heading due east. The disorientation hit him like vertigo. He'd gotten turned around somehow, lost his direction in a forest where he'd worked for 14 years. The cold arrived without warning. It didn't creep or gradually intensify. One moment, the air temperature was the typical October chill of Pacific Northwest autumn. The next, it was January at high elevation. Chris could see his breath-forming clouds that hung in the air without dissipating. The moisture on the foliage around him began to crystallize, tiny ice crystals forming on moss and fern fronds in real time, growing, spreading, as if winter were accelerating through the space he occupied. His analytical mind tried to process this. Microclimates existed, certainly. Cold air drainage from higher elevations, thermal inversions in valleys. These were documented phenomena. But a temperature drop of 40 degrees in 5 seconds? Localized freezing while the surrounding forest remained untouched? There was no meteorological model for this. Chris became aware of a sound. It came from everywhere and nowhere. A vocalization that might have been wind through a tight space or might have been something trying to form words. The pitch rose and fell, never quite resolving into language, never quite becoming just noise. It had a quality that made Chris's jaw tighten involuntarily, a resonance that seemed to vibrate in his bones rather than his ears. He forced himself to catalog what he was experiencing. Auditory phenomenon of unknown origin, extreme localized temperature anomaly, visual disturbance in peripheral awareness, spatial disorientation. Symptoms that, in a patient, might suggest neurological event, carbon monoxide exposure, dehydration, altitude sickness. But Chris knew his own physiology. He was hydrated, had acclimated to altitude years ago, and there was no source of carbon monoxide in the middle of a rainforest. The sound grew louder, and then he saw her. 30 meters through the trees, standing absolutely motionless, was a figure in white. Chris's throat closed. His mind refused the image for a full 3 seconds before accepting what his eyes reported. A woman, or the shape of a woman, dressed entirely in white fabric that hung straight down despite the wind that moved everything else. Long black hair fell past her shoulders, obscuring any features he might have used to identify her as Amanda Pierce or anyone else. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood between 2 ancient cedars, impossibly still, impossibly present. Chris tried to call out. His voice emerged as barely a whisper. "Amanda?" The temperature dropped further. The ice crystals on the vegetation had become a shell of frost, spreading outward from where Chris stood in a visible wave, killing the green and replacing it with white. His breath came in rapid, visible bursts. His fingers had begun to ache with cold. The figure in white tilted its head. The movement was wrong. Not the way a human turns to look at something, but mechanical, jerky, as if the neck joints worked on different principles than bone and muscle. The angle continued past what anatomy should allow, 30 degrees, 45, until the head hung at an impossible cant. Chris's legs made the decision his conscious mind was still processing. He ran. He crashed through the understory toward where he thought Amanda's camp should be, his rational faculties breaking down under an input of sensory data that didn't fit any model he possessed. His boots skidded on frost-slicked moss. Low branches whipped his face. The sound followed him. That rising, falling vocalization that might have been wind or weeping or words in a language his brain refused to process. He burst into the clearing and stopped, chest heaving. Amanda's tent was coated in frost. Ice crystals covered every surface, transforming the nylon into something that looked carved from frozen glass. The cookpot had ice radiating from its base in fractal patterns. The audio recorder's LED had gone dark. The campsite had become winter. Chris's mind, trained to analyze and categorize, tried desperately to find framework. Freak weather event. Microclimate. His own perception altered by altitude or stress or equipment fumes. But the forest beyond the clearing remained green and untouched, separated from the frozen camp by a border so sharp it looked drawn with a blade. He grabbed his pack from where he'd left it, feeling frost crack under his fingers. His backup GPS, his paper maps, his emergency beacon. He needed to reach the trailhead, contact the main station, get an explanation for this that fit within the boundaries of the natural world he understood. As he turned to leave, Chris's eyes fell on Amanda's field notebook, still in its Ziploc bag, still open to that last entry. New words had appeared on the page below her final notes, written in the same silver Sharpie she'd been using. "She's so cold. She won't stop looking at me. I can't leave. The cold won't let me leave." The handwriting was Amanda's. The ink was fresh. Chris's hands shook as he photographed the page, the camera's flash reflecting off the frost coating everything. He stuffed the notebook into his jacket and started back down the trail at a pace just short of a full run, his mind fracturing between what he'd seen and what he could accept as real. The trail that had taken him 4 hours to ascend seemed to stretch endlessly downward. His watch showed 2:17. He should reach the trailhead before dark even with the incoming weather. But the forest had changed. The proportions felt wrong. Trees that should have been familiar landmarks appeared in unexpected locations. Twice he passed the same distinctive nurse log, recognizing the exact pattern of moss and fungi growing on its decomposing mass, though his compass insisted he'd maintained a straight bearing. The cold followed him. Not the supernatural freeze from Amanda's camp, but a persistent chill that stayed 5 degrees colder than it should have been, as if something were pulling heat from the air around him. Chris's breath plumed. His joints ached. The moisture in his clothes felt like it was starting to form ice crystals against his skin. At what should have been mile marker 5, Chris found something that stopped him dead. Another strip of white fabric hanging from a branch across the trail. He approached it with the kind of desperate hope that maybe this one would be different, would have some rational explanation. A trail marker he'd forgotten, a piece of Amanda's torn tent that had blown this far. But it was identical to the first. White cotton, impossibly clean, covered in those black Japanese characters, radiating cold like a physical force. Chris stood before it, his scientific training warring with sensory input that violated every principle of natural law he'd spent his adult life studying. Fabric didn't emit cold. Missing persons didn't write new journal entries after abandoning their camps. Temperature didn't drop 40 degrees in localized pockets for no meteorological reason, but he'd seen it, documented it, photographed it, his camera. Chris pulled out his Canon PowerShot and scrolled through the images he'd taken. Amanda's camp, the equipment, the notebook, that first white cloth marker. The LCD screen showed each image clearly. Then he reached the photos of the figure in white between the trees. The images showed only forest. Trees, ferns, moss-covered logs. No figure, no woman in white. Just empty space where Chris had seen her standing. He scrolled forward and back, checking the sequence. The timestamps were correct. The photos had been taken when he remembered taking them. But the figure didn't appear in any frame. His analytical mind tried to find purchase on this fact. The human eye was susceptible to pareidolia, seeing patterns and faces where none existed. Stress and fear could create hallucinations. Maybe he'd seen a configuration of light and shadow that his pattern recognition systems had interpreted as a human form. Except he'd seen it move, seen the head tilt at that impossible angle. A sound reached him through the trees. Singing. Chris's entire body locked rigid. It was definitely singing, not wind, not the acoustic tricks that water and stone could play in mountain forests. A woman's voice, high and clear, following a melody that rose and fell in patterns Chris didn't recognize. The lyrics, if they were lyrics, came through as syllables that might have been Japanese, might have been some older language, might have been something that only approximated human speech. The voice was coming from upslope, from the direction of Amanda's camp. Every instinct Chris possessed screamed at him to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that voice. But beneath the fear, a part of him that was still a ranger, still responsible for Amanda Pierce's safety, noted that the voice might be her. Hypothermia caused confusion, disorientation, inappropriate behavior. If Amanda was alive but compromised, she might not respond to calls, might wander, might sing nonsense syllables while her core temperature dropped toward fatal levels. Chris turned and started back upslope, moving toward the voice. His radio remained dead. His GPS showed coordinates that couldn't possibly be correct. The elevation reading had him 800 feet higher than Amanda's camp, despite walking downhill. His compass needle spun lazily, never quite settling on magnetic north. The singing grew louder as he climbed. It had a rhythmic, cyclical quality now, the same phrases repeating with slight variations, building toward something Chris's hindbrain recognized as ritual, even if his conscious mind rejected the category. The temperature continued to drop. Frost formed on his jacket collar. His face had gone numb. He emerged into Amanda's clearing for the second time. The campsite had transformed beyond simple freezing. Ice formations rose from the ground like sculptures, twisting up through the tent's collapsed walls, encasing the cook stove and weather station in crystalline shells. The entire clearing glowed with reflected light from ice surfaces that caught and amplified the dim forest illumination. It looked like a shrine. It looked like a grave. The singing came from the tent. Chris approached slowly, each footstep crunching through frost that shouldn't exist at 2,800 feet elevation in October. The tent's entrance hung open, revealing darkness inside, punctuated by that strange ice glow. The voice came from within, still following that cycling melody, still using those syllables that Chris's language centers couldn't quite parse. He reached the entrance. "Amanda?" The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, Chris could hear his own pulse thundering in his ears, could hear the creak of ice expanding, could hear something breathing that wasn't him. He pulled out his flashlight and aimed it through the tent entrance. Amanda Pierce sat in the corner, her sleeping bag wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes open and staring at nothing. Frost covered her hair, her eyelashes, her lips. She wasn't breathing. She was absolutely certainly dead. Had been dead for at least a day based on the lividity visible on her exposed skin. But she was sitting upright, and her lips were moving, forming the words to that song Chris had been hearing. His mind simply refused. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. Violated every principle of biology, physics, medicine. Dead bodies didn't sing. Dead bodies didn't maintain posture. Dead bodies didn't have frost forming in real time on their surfaces while Chris watched, spreading outward from the core like something was pulling heat. Not just from the air, but from the fundamental molecular motion that defined temperature. Chris stumbled backward. His boot caught on a tent stake and he went down hard, landing on his back in frost that exploded into powder on impact. Above him, the forest canopy had gone white. Every branch coated in ice, every needle on every conifer transformed into crystal. The dead woman's voice continued singing from inside the tent. And then she emerged. Not Amanda. The figure in white that Chris had seen in the forest, now crawling out of the tent entrance with that same mechanical wrong movement, joints bending at angles that human anatomy didn't allow. Long black hair fell forward, obscuring any face. White fabric, funeral white, Chris's mind supplied, though he didn't know how he knew, hung from a body that moved without seeming to displace air or compress the frost it passed over. The figure stood, or unfolded. The motion didn't follow the physics of standing, didn't use muscles or balance or leverage. It simply transitioned from horizontal to vertical, rising to a height that was too tall, proportions that were almost but not quite human. Chris tried to move. His body wouldn't respond. Not paralysis exactly, but as if the cold had penetrated so deep that it had frozen neural pathways, turned muscle and bone into something that no longer took commands from his brain. He could feel his heart beating, feel air moving in and out of his lungs, but his limbs might as well have belonged to someone else. The figure in white turned toward him. There was a face under that black hair. Chris caught a glimpse of features that might have been beautiful once, might have been human but had become something else. Skin the color of snow, eyes that reflected no light, a mouth that held an expression Chris's pattern recognition systems couldn't interpret, because it wasn't any expression evolution had prepared humans to read. The cold intensified beyond anything Chris had experienced. His breath stopped forming clouds because the moisture was freezing before it left his mouth. Ice crystals formed in his nasal passages. His eyeballs ached. The exposed skin on his face began to burn with cold that felt like fire. The figure raised one arm. If it was an arm, if those were fingers extending from the hand, though they seemed too long and had too many joints. It pointed at Chris, and then it spoke. Not the singing from before. Not any sound Chris could categorize as vocalization. The noise that came from the figure bypassed his ears entirely and manifested directly in his skull. A sensation of words forming from the inside out, meaning without language. Communication that operated on principles Chris had no framework to understand. But he understood it anyway. She had been a woman named Keiko Nakamura. She had died in 1943, 17 years old, from pneumonia, in a camp where the government had imprisoned her family for the crime of Japanese ancestry. Her parents, grief-mad, had carried her body into these mountains and buried her in secret, performing rites they remembered imperfectly, marking the grave with white cloth and prayers in a language they'd been forbidden to teach their daughter. She had died hating the cold barracks, the barbed wire, the casual cruelty of guards who saw her as enemy, hating the cough that filled her lungs with fluid, the fever that burned her brain, the weakness that made her die in a place that wasn't home while war raged and the world forgot her family existed. That hatred hadn't ended with death. It had soaked into the soil, into the roots of trees that grew from her grave, into the mycological networks that connected forest and rot and rebirth. Keiko Nakamura had become something the old stories warned about, an onryo, a spirit of such intense rage that it persisted beyond the grave, seeking vengeance not on specific people, but on the living themselves, on the audacity of continuing to breathe and walk and exist while she was cold and dead and forgotten in the darkness under the mountain. Amanda Pierce had found the grave, had disturbed it while marking her transects, studying her fungi, cataloging the underground networks that spread through the soil where Keiko's body had long since dissolved. And Keiko had noticed. Chris understood all of this in an instant, the knowledge arriving complete and terrible. And he understood something else. Amanda had tried to leave, had packed up her camp, had started down the trail, but the cold had followed her, had surrounded her, had filled her lungs while she ran, had stopped her heart while she called for help into a radio that transmitted nothing but static into air that had grown too cold for sound to travel. The figure lowered its arm. The cold began to recede, not warming but pulling back like a tide, leaving Chris gasping on the frost-covered ground. He could move again, could stand, could turn, could run. He ran, down the trail without looking back, his legs pumping with the desperate energy of prey fleeing a predator, though some part of him understood that nothing was chasing him. The spirit had made its point, had shown him what it was, what it could do, what had happened to Amanda Pierce. It had no interest in Chris specifically. He hadn't disturbed the grave, hadn't violated the burial site. He was just another warm body moving through a cold forest, notable only in that he might tell the story, might spread the knowledge that some places remained haunted, some deaths produced presences that didn't fade with time. The trail still felt wrong, still stretched and compressed in ways that defied topography, but Chris didn't stop to analyze. He ran until his lungs burned, ran until his legs shook, ran until he burst out of the tree line onto the paved parking area where Amanda's Honda Civic still sat gathering moisture. His truck was there, still real, still solid, still part of the world that made sense. Chris fumbled with his keys, dropped them, grabbed them from the frost-free pavement with shaking hands. The truck started on the first try. The heater blasted cold air that would take miles to warm. The radio picked up a classic rock station from Port Angeles playing Lynyrd Skynyrd, like this was just a normal October afternoon in Washington State. Chris drove. He drove all the way back to the ranger station, his hands locked on the steering wheel, his mind carefully not thinking about what he'd seen. When he pulled into the parking lot, his supervisor was standing outside, radio in hand, concern written across his weathered face. "Wade, Jesus, we lost your signal 6 hours ago. What happened up there?" Chris sat in the truck, engine still running, heat finally starting to push warm air through the vents. 6 hours. His watch showed 8:34 p.m. He'd been on the mountain for 11 hours, though it felt like both forever and no time at all. "Found her," Chris said. His voice came out flat, emotionless. "Amanda Pierce. She's dead. At her campsite near the Salt Duke confluence." "Dead? What? Medical emergency? Exposure?" "Exposure," Chris heard himself say. "Hypothermia. Severe localized cold pocket, some kind of weather phenomenon I can't explain. The entire campsite is frozen." His supervisor stared at him. "Frozen? Chris, it's 50 degrees out. There's no front moving through." "I know." Chris pulled the field notebook from his jacket, saw the frost still clinging to the plastic bag, watched it melt under the truck's interior lights. "I documented everything. Photos, GPS coordinates, notes. You'll need to send a recovery team at first light. Are you okay? You look—" "I'm going home," Chris interrupted. "I'll write a full report tomorrow, but I'm going home now." He put the truck in reverse before his supervisor could respond, before anyone could ask more questions, before he had to try to explain things he didn't have words for. He drove the 45 minutes to his cabin in Forks, seeing nothing of the road, operating on autopilot and muscle memory. Inside, with the doors locked and every light on, Chris finally stopped moving. He sat at his kitchen table and opened Amanda's field notebook, reading through her entries, seeing the progression from scientific observation to growing unease to those final words about cold and being watched. Then he looked at the last page, the one where new words had appeared in her handwriting after she was dead. Below those words, "She's so cold. She won't stop looking at me. I can't leave. The cold won't let me leave." Were more characters in black ink, not English this time, but those same Japanese symbols he'd seen on the white cloth markers. Chris photographed them with hands that still shook. He opened his laptop, uploaded the photo, and spent 3 hours with online translation tools and character recognition software, piecing together meaning from symbols he couldn't read. The characters formed a phrase that appeared in multiple sources about Japanese funeral rites and vengeful spirits. Kore wa urameshiya. Kore wa samui. Kore wa wasurenai. This is grudge. This is cold. This will not be forgotten. Chris shut the laptop. He sat in his kitchen with all the lights on, listening to the ordinary sounds of his cabin settling, the refrigerator humming, the wind moving through Douglas fir outside his windows. Normal sounds. Real sounds. The sounds of a world that operated on principles he understood. But underneath those sounds, so faint he might have imagined it, Chris thought he heard singing. The recovery team found Amanda Pierce's body the next morning, exactly where Chris had reported. The official cause of death was listed as hypothermia, though the coroner noted unusual presentation and couldn't explain why localized freezing had occurred in conditions that weren't conducive to it. The campsite showed evidence of severe frost damage, despite ambient temperatures that remained above freezing throughout the period of Amanda's disappearance. Chris's report was filed. His photographs were archived. His GPS data, unreliable and contradictory though it was, went into evidence. The case was closed as accidental death due to environmental exposure, with a recommendation that backcountry researchers be required to carry more sophisticated emergency communication equipment. Chris requested a transfer 3 weeks later. He was reassigned to Crater Lake National Park in Oregon, where the forests were different, where the geology was volcanic rather than glacial. where no hidden graves from internment camps lay under the soil. He told himself it was for career development. He told himself he needed a change after 14 years at Olympic. He didn't tell anyone about the cold spots he'd started noticing, small things. The air near his bathroom mirror always 10 degrees cooler than the rest of the house. Frost forming on his truck's windshield on mornings when none of his neighbors' vehicles showed ice. The way his breath sometimes plumed visible even inside heated rooms. Minor anomalies. Probably coincidental. Almost certainly his imagination. His mind still processing trauma from that day on the mountain. But Chris kept his thermostat 5 degrees higher than he used to. He avoided forests with old-growth cedars. And sometimes late at night when sleep wouldn't come, he would hear that singing. High and clear, and following a melody from another century, from another culture, from a death that had never properly ended. He never went back to Olympic National Park, never hiked the Hoh River Trail again, and he never ever spoke about what he'd really seen in Amanda Pierce's frozen campsite, about the figure in white that had shown him the difference between the dead who rested and the dead who remembered, because some truths were too large for his analytical mind to contain. Some realities violated the natural laws he'd built his life around, and some cold went deeper than temperature, deeper than weather, all the way down to the level where hatred and grief could persist beyond flesh, beyond time, beyond any scientific framework that tried to explain them away. Chris Wade had been a man who believed in observable phenomena, in cause and effect, in a universe that could be measured and understood. That man had walked into the Hoh rainforest on an October morning in 2009. A different man had walked out, and even now, 2 years later, working in different forests under different trees, that different man kept his cabin warm and his lights on, and his doors locked against a cold that had nothing to do with weather. The cold remembered him, and he suspected it always would. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Christopher Mercer had been tracking disappearances in Olympic National Park for 11 years, and the patterns had always made sense. Hikers underestimated the Hoh rainforest's density, or they ignored weather warnings, or they simply wandered off trail and succumbed to hypothermia in the relentless Pacific Northwest drizzle. The numbers formed clean statistical clusters. 73% were inexperienced day hikers, 18% were solo backpackers with inadequate gear, 9% were legitimate mysteries. Until he started looking at the 9% more carefully. The call about Hannah Doyle came through dispatch at 6:47 a.m. on October 14, 2008. Chris was already at his desk in the Port Angeles Ranger Station, 3 hours into a database review that was turning his coffee cold. The Motorola radio crackled with Deputy Ranger Tom Iverson's voice, tight with the controlled urgency that meant something was wrong beyond the usual lost hiker protocol. SR coordinator needed at Hoh Ranger Station. Missing person, 24 hours. Female, 26 years old, experienced backpacker. Last known position was near the Confluence Trail. Mile marker 4.7. Chris logged the call details with mechanical precision, but something in his mind had already started flagging discrepancies. The Confluence Trail wasn't technical. Hannah Doyle, he pulled up her wilderness permit on the aging Dell desktop, had listed advanced backcountry experience, had filed a proper itinerary, carried a Garmin eTrex GPS unit according to her permit notes. The weather had been overcast but mild, no precipitation, temperatures in the mid-50s. She should have been fine. He arrived at the Hoh station 90 minutes later, his Ford Ranger splashing through puddles that never quite dried in this part of the rainforest. The Sitka spruce trees pressed close to the narrow access road, their trunks thick with moss that seemed to absorb sound. Everything here felt muffled, wrapped in green silence. Tom Everson met him outside, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a printed map in the other. Tom was 52, built like a fire hydrant with the kind of weathered competence that came from 3 decades in wilderness management. But his jaw was tight. "Got something weird, Chris," Tom said without preamble. Hannah Doyle checked in at the visitor center Saturday morning, 9:15 a.m. Filed a 3-day solo permit for the Hoh River Trail, planning to camp at Elk Lake. She had all the right gear. I saw it myself. MSR tent, water filtration, bear canister, the works. She signed out with a note that she'd call her sister from the trailhead phone when she got back Monday evening. And? Chris took the map, scanning the marked route with practiced efficiency. Monday came and went. Sister called us Tuesday morning. We sent a team up yesterday afternoon, found her camp at Elk Lake. Tents still standing, perfectly set up. Sleeping bags inside, laid out like she was planning to come back to it. Food's in the bear canister, untouched. But her day pack's gone, and so is she. Chris felt the first tickle of wrongness at the base of his skull. Signs of animal activity? None. No tracks around the tent except hers. No disturbance to the camp. It's like she just walked away from a perfectly good setup and vanished. Footprints? Tom's mouth became a thin line. Yeah, that's the weird part. Her prints lead away from camp, heading northeast off trail. We followed them for maybe 200 yards, then they just stop. Stop? Not fade. Stop. Like she took a step and then just wasn't there anymore. The ground's soft enough. Plenty of mud and decomposing vegetation. Should have been easy to track, but it's like she lifted off the ground. Chris didn't believe in people lifting off the ground, but he did believe in evidence, and evidence was telling him something was off. He spent the next 20 minutes reviewing the case file, Hannah's permit application, her vehicle registration in the trailhead parking lot, the initial search team's report. Everything documented and reasonable, except for the part where an experienced hiker's tracks vanished in the middle of temperate rainforest. The search team assembled by noon. 6 rangers, including Chris and Tom, plus 2 volunteers from Peninsula Search and Rescue who knew the terrain. Chris distributed maps marked with search grids, assigned radio frequencies, reviewed the protocol. His mind was already running statistical probabilities. Time elapsed since disappearance, weather conditions, available shelter, water sources. The numbers should have pointed toward a reasonable search area, but they weren't lining up the way they should. They hiked in under a ceiling of gray that pressed down between the cathedral arches of ancient spruce and hemlock. The Hoh River Trail was well maintained, but the forest on either side was nearly impenetrable. Massive nurse logs covered in ferns, sword ferns clustered so thick you couldn't see the ground, big leaf maples draped with club moss creating curtains of green. Chris had worked search and rescue in this rainforest for 6 years, and it never stopped feeling like the trees were watching. Hannah's camp sat in a small clearing beside Elk Lake, exactly where her permit indicated. Chris examined it with forensic attention while the team spread out in search patterns. The tent was a North Face VE-25 expedition grade, staked down properly and guyed out against wind. Inside he found the sleeping bag, a Western mountaineering down bag rated to 20 degrees, unzipped and spread open as if Hannah had been sleeping in it and then gotten up. Her clothes were folded neatly in one corner. A paperback novel, some historical thing about the Romanian Revolution, lay face down on top of the sleeping bag with a bookmark 3/4 through. The bear canister held 5 days' worth of freeze-dried meals, all still sealed. Her water filter hung from a loop inside the tent. Her headlamp sat on top of the bear canister, batteries full. What was missing? Her day pack, her GPS unit, 1 fleece jacket, her hiking boots. What that meant? She'd gotten dressed and left camp deliberately, taking only what she'd need for a day hike. But her permit indicated she was staying at this camp, not moving on. Why would she leave a secure camp without telling anyone, without taking her tent down, without even eating breakfast first? Chris photographed everything with his digital Canon, documenting angles and positions. Then he moved outside and began examining the ground. Hannah's boot prints were clear in the soft earth around the tent. Vask women's hiking boots, size 8, distinctive tread pattern. He could see where she'd moved around camp, collecting water from the lake, setting up her tent, walking to the designated bathroom area. All normal patterns. But then, on the northeast side of camp, her prints led away into the forest in a straight line. Tom joined him, and together they followed the trail. The tracks were deliberate, evenly spaced, showing no signs of running or panic. Hannah had been walking with purpose, heading into thick forest with no trail, no landmark, no obvious destination. Chris measured the stride length, 28 inches, consistent and steady. At 194 feet from the camp, the prints stopped. Not faded, not obscured, stopped. Chris knelt, examining the spot. The last footprint was complete, perfectly defined in a patch of mud between two rotting logs. The toe pointed northeast, and then nothing. He looked up, searching for anything that might explain it. A fallen log she might have stepped onto, a rock outcrop, a stream. But there was only more forest, more ferns, more moss. "This doesn't make sense," he said, more to himself than Tom. "You want to hear what really doesn't make sense?" Tom's voice had dropped. "Come here." Tom led him 20 feet to the right where the forest floor dipped into a shallow depression. There in the mud were more boot prints, the same pattern, the same size, Hannah's boots. But these prints were heading back toward camp. "Those shouldn't be there," Chris said slowly. "Yeah, and look at this." Tom pointed to one of the returning prints. Inside Hannah's boot impression was another mark, something that looked like a handprint, but elongated, the fingers too long. The digits pressed deep into the mud, deeper than Hannah's boot print, as if something heavy had stepped there after she had. Chris took 6 photographs of the print from different angles. His hand wasn't shaking. He had excellent motor control even under stress, but something in his chest felt tight. Could be an animal. Bear, maybe. "You ever see a bear print shaped like that?" No, he hadn't. They expanded the search pattern, calling in the teams. For 3 hours they combed the area in careful grids, but they found nothing else. No more tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication that Hannah Doyle had ever existed beyond that inexplicable trail that led nowhere, and the camp she'd abandoned. By 4 p.m. the light was failing under the canopy, and Chris called off the search until morning. Back at the station, he couldn't let it go. While Tom coordinated with the sheriff's department and Hannah's family, Chris opened his database and started searching. Disappearances in the Hoh River watershed, past 20 years. The system pulled 17 cases. He filtered for unresolved, got 8. Filtered for similar circumstances, experienced hikers, camps left intact, no clear cause. 3 cases. He printed the files and spread them across his desk. 1997, Michael Sorensen, 31, solo backpacker. Camp found at mile marker 6. 2 tent standing, food intact. Tracks led into forest and terminated. Case closed as presumed accidental death, body never recovered. 2002, Rebecca and Thomas Klein, married couple, both 45. Camp found at mile marker 5.8, both tents properly secured. No signs of struggle. Tracks for both individuals led away from camp in different directions, both trails ending without explanation. Case closed as double fatality, bodies never recovered. 2006, David Chen, 28, experienced wilderness guide, camp at mile marker 7.1. Identical pattern, camp intact, tracks leading away and stopping, body never recovered. Chris stared at the files. The pattern was there, undeniable. Every 5 or 6 years, someone disappeared from the Hoh River Trail corridor in exactly the same way. Experienced hikers, intact camps, tracks that terminated, and now Hannah Doyle made 5. He opened a browser window on his computer and started searching for anything that might explain it. Geological anomalies, historical incidents, local folklore. The dial-up connection was slow, and he had to be patient while pages loaded. Most of what he found was standard Pacific Northwest material, Sasquatch sightings, which he dismissed immediately, and Native American legends about forest spirits, which were interesting but didn't match the specifics. Then he found something else, a scanned archive from the Forks Forum, the local newspaper, dated August 1952. The article was about a logger named Eugene Dalka, who'd gone missing in the Hoh watershed. According to the report, Dalka had been a Romanian immigrant who'd worked at one of the old logging camps near the river. He'd been found dead 3 days after disappearing, his body discovered in a shallow grave he'd apparently dug himself. The coroner's report noted unusual deterioration of the remains inconsistent with time elapsed, and evidence of self-inflicted wounds suggesting psychological break. But it was the quoted statement from Dalka's supervisor that caught Chris's attention. Gene kept saying something was following him from the old country, said he'd done something back in Romania, violated some kind of tradition, and now it had found him. He talked about needing to bury himself before it got worse. We thought he'd lost his mind. Chris kept reading. Dalka had been from a village near Brasov in Transylvania. He'd emigrated in 1949, shortly after the communist takeover. The article mentioned that other Romanian immigrants in the area had refused to help search for him, claiming he was Strigoi, which the article translated as a kind of vampire or revenant from Romanian folklore. Chris's rational mind wanted to dismiss it. Superstition, cultural artifact, nothing to do with missing hikers in 2008. But his analytical mind kept circling back to the pattern. Eugene Dalka had gone missing in the Ho watershed in 1952. And every 5 or 6 years since, someone else vanished in exactly the same way. What if it wasn't a coincidence? He found himself searching for information about Strigoi. Most of what came up was modern vampire fiction, but he dug deeper, finding academic sources and folklore databases. According to Romanian tradition, Strigoi were the restless dead who rose from their graves with purpose and intelligence. Unlike Western vampire myths, Strigoi weren't necessarily predatory in the Gothic sense. They returned to resolve unfinished business, to drain the life force from those they'd known, to enact revenge or complete tasks left undone. They were said to be able to move unseen, to make people forget, to create confusion and missing time. They could appear as mist or shadow. They left specific signs: animals behaving strangely, a sense of oppressive presence, footprints that appeared and disappeared, and sometimes, according to one particularly detailed source, they left marks that looked like elongated handprints where they'd touched the earth. Chris closed the browser window. This was absurd. He didn't believe in vampires or revenants or anything that couldn't be explained by rational analysis. People disappeared in the wilderness for mundane reasons: injury, exposure, animal attacks, bad decisions. The fact that there was a pattern just meant there was an underlying cause he hadn't identified yet. Maybe something about the geography of that particular area made people disoriented. Maybe there were unmapped caves or sinkholes. Maybe there was a psychological factor, some kind of localized panic response triggered by the oppressive atmosphere of the rainforest. But he kept thinking about those elongated fingerprints in the mud. The next morning, Chris returned to the Ho with a different approach. Instead of searching for Hannah, he was searching for the pattern itself. He brought survey maps, a compass, his GPS unit, and a copy of the old newspaper article about Eugene Dalka. Tom came with him, along with Sarah Reeves, a younger ranger who'd grown up in Forks and knew the local history. "You really think there's something to this vampire stuff?" Tom asked as they hiked in. "No," Chris said, "but I think there's a pattern, and patterns have explanations." He'd mapped all 5 disappearance sites on his survey map, and now he was looking for connections. They weren't random. All 5 locations fell within a 2-mile radius, clustered around a specific section of the Ho River, where it curved sharply to the northwest. The elevation was consistent, all between 600 and 650 feet. And when he overlaid the topographic details, he saw something interesting. All 5 sites were near massive Sitka spruce trees, at least 300 years old. "Sarah," he said, "do you know if there were any logging camps in this area in the 1950s? Sarah consulted her notes. She'd done research on Olympics logging history for a presentation. "Yeah, actually. There was a camp right around here, operated by Forks Timber until 1954. They mostly cut down in the valley, but there were some old-growth harvests up here too. It shut down after some kind of accident." "What kind of accident?" "Records are spotty, but apparently several workers died. Something about a collapse. The company paid settlements to the families and closed the camp. After that, this whole area became part of the national park." Chris felt pieces clicking together in his mind, but they formed a picture he didn't like. Eugene Dalka had worked at a logging camp in this area. He'd died here in 1952, and ever since, people had been vanishing from this specific zone in a way that defied rational explanation. They reached Hannah's camp by mid-morning. Chris had the team establish a perimeter, and then he began a methodical examination of the surrounding area, moving in expanding circles from the tent. He was looking for anything unusual, disturbed earth, old structures, anything that might explain the pattern. It was Sarah who found it. "Chris, you need to see this." She was standing about 300 yards northwest of the camp, near the base of an enormous Sitka spruce that had to be 500 years old. The tree's roots had created a complex network of channels and hollows in the forest floor, and in one of these hollows, partially obscured by ferns, was a depression in the earth. Chris knelt beside it. The depression was roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet wide, the shape and size of a grave. The earth had settled over time, but when he brushed away the ferns and moss, he could see the outline clearly. "Think that's Dalka?" Tom asked quietly. "Maybe." Chris took photographs, marked the location on his GPS. Then he noticed something else. Around the grave, pressed into the soft earth at regular intervals, were marks. They looked like handprints, but elongated, the fingers impossibly long. The same marks they'd found near Hannah's trail. His rational mind was screaming at him that this meant nothing, that it was coincidence, that there had to be a logical explanation. But he couldn't stop thinking about the folklore he'd read. Strigoi rose from their graves. They returned with purpose. They drained the life from those around them. What if Eugene Dalka had become exactly what he'd feared? "We need to exhume this," Chris said. Tom stared at him. "You want to dig up what might be a 60-year-old grave in the middle of a national park based on a hunch about vampires?" When Tom put it that way, it sounded insane. But Chris couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected. The pattern of disappearances, the grave, the marks in the earth, the historical records. "I want to understand what happened. We have 5 unsolved disappearances, all following the same pattern. If there's evidence here that explains it, we need to document it." It took until the next day to get authorization. Chris had to file reports, justify the exhumation, coordinate with law enforcement and the park superintendent. But by Friday morning, they had a forensics team from the King County Medical Examiner's Office, along with representatives from the National Park Service and the FBI, who'd taken an interest in the pattern of disappearances. They excavated carefully, documenting everything. At 3 feet down, they found wood, the remnants of a crude casket. At 4 feet, they found bones. The forensic anthropologist, a precise woman named Dr. Cassidy, spent 2 hours examining the remains in situ before allowing them to be removed. Then she called Chris over. "This is unusual," she said. "The body appears to have been buried in a flexed position, almost fetal. That's not standard for American burial practices, but it's consistent with some Eastern European traditions, particularly in rural Romania. Can you tell how he died?" Dr. Cassidy pointed to the skeleton's hands. "There are tool marks on several of the bones, ribs, vertebrae. Looks like they were made perimortem, meaning right around the time of death. And look at this." She indicated the skull. There was a hole in the cranium, just above the left eye socket. That's from a spike or stake driven through the skull post-mortem. Again, not standard American practice, but consistent with certain Eastern European traditions related to preventing the dead from rising. Someone staked him? After he was already dead, yes. Someone went to considerable effort to ensure this body stayed buried. But it hadn't worked. Or maybe it had for a while. Chris thought about the timeline. Dalka had died in 1952, and the first disappearance after that was in 1997. 45 years. What if the stake had held for decades and then something had changed? A tree root breaking the casket? Decomposition weakening the binding? He was thinking like a superstitious fool, and he knew it. But he couldn't stop. That night, alone in his office, Chris couldn't focus on his reports. He kept coming back to one question. If Eugene Dalka had somehow become Strigoi, why was he taking people? What was the purpose? He went back to the folklore sources, reading more carefully. According to tradition, Strigoi could drain life force slowly, sustaining themselves on the energy of the living. They were said to create confusion, to make people forget, to draw victims to them through compulsion. The victims would walk willingly to their doom, and afterward there would be no memory, no trace, just absence. And sometimes, the sources said, if a Strigoi fed enough, it could become strong enough to take physical form again, to return to the world of the living, not as a corpse, but as something that appeared almost human. Chris found himself thinking about Hannah's camp, the book about Romanian history, left open, the neat arrangement of her belongings, the deliberate way she'd walked into the forest as if she'd had a destination in mind. What if she hadn't been running from something? What if she'd been going toward it? His phone rang, making him jump. The caller ID showed Sarah Reeves. "Chris, I found something else." Her voice was tight. "I was going through the old logging camp records at the Historical Society. Eugene Dalka had a daughter. She was 10 when he died. Her name was Elena." "Okay, what about her?" "She's still alive. She lives in Port Angeles. I have her address." Chris drove to Port Angeles that night, arriving at a small house on the west side of town just after 8 p.m. Elena Dalka, now Elena Morrison after 2 marriages, was 76 years old, a tiny woman with sharp eyes and hands that trembled slightly when she opened the door. "You're asking about my father," she said before Chris could explain why he was there. "I wondered when someone would finally come." She made tea and they sat in her living room, which smelled like lavender and old books. On the walls were photographs, family pictures, vacation snapshots, the ordinary documentation of a long life. But in one frame on the mantel was an old black and white photograph of a man in work clothes standing in front of a massive tree. "That's him," Elena said. "That was taken a month before he disappeared." Chris asked gentle questions, and Elena answered with the careful precision of someone who'd been waiting a long time to tell this story. "My father was a good man," she said, "but he was haunted. He came to America to escape something, but he believed it had followed him. He talked about things from the old village, traditions, curses. My mother told me to ignore it, said he was just superstitious. But after he died, I started to understand." "Understand what?" Elena looked at him for a long moment. "My father killed someone back in Romania. It was during the war. A man who'd collaborated with the fascists, who'd betrayed the village to the Iron Guard. My father and some other men hanged him. It was vigilante justice, but everyone agreed the man deserved it. What they didn't know was that this man was Strigoi Viu, a living witch, someone who practiced the old dark rites. And the tradition said that if you killed someone like that without the proper rituals, without burning the heart and scattering the ashes, they would return. Not right away, but eventually. And they would take everything from you. Your father believed this man came back? He knew it. He could feel it following him, even across the ocean. That's why he tried to bury himself. He thought if he died properly with the rituals, it might stop. But it didn't work. Because he'd done it wrong, don't you see? He'd violated the traditions, and there was no way to fix it." Chris felt cold, despite the warmth of the room. "Mrs. Morrison, 5 people have disappeared near where your father died, all of them in the same way. Do you think—" "I think my father became the thing he feared," Elena said quietly. "I think he's out there, in the forest, and he's still trying to resolve what he did. He's taking people because he needs their life force. He's trying to become strong enough to return to finish something." "What something?" "The man he killed, Vasily Comenescu. That man had a granddaughter. She emigrated to America in the 1990s. I tried to warn her, but she didn't believe me. Said I was a crazy old woman." Chris's mouth felt dry. "What was her name?" "Hannah. Hannah Doyle. She changed her surname, but her maiden name was Comenescu." The room tilted. Everything he'd been trying to rationalize, every logical explanation he'd been clinging to, crumbled. Hannah hadn't been a random victim. She'd been the target all along. Eugene Dalka had been drawing strength from other victims, other lives, building up power for decades so that he could finally take the one life that mattered, the descendant of the man he'd murdered. "Where is she?" Chris asked. If he took her, where would he take her? Elena's eyes were wet. To his grave. That's where Strigoi are strongest. That's where he'd complete the ritual. Chris was out of the house and calling Tom before his rational mind could reassert control. Part of him was screaming that this was insane, that he was chasing folklore and superstition. But a larger part, the part that had seen the evidence, mapped the pattern, examined the inexplicable, knew that every other explanation had failed. They assembled a team and returned to the Hoe at first light. Chris led them directly to the gravesite where the forensics team had excavated. But when they arrived, the excavation had been disturbed. The tarp they'd placed over the site was torn away. The earth around the grave was freshly churned, as if something had clawed its way out from below. And there were boot prints, Hannah's distinctive Vask tread, leading away from the grave toward the river. She's alive, Chris said. We need to find her now. They followed the tracks. For the first time, the trail didn't vanish. It led them through dense forest, over fallen logs, through stands of ferns and Devil's Club, always trending toward the sound of running water. After 40 minutes of hard hiking, they emerged at a bend in the Hoe River where the water ran dark and fast over ancient stones. Hannah Doyle was standing in the shallows. She was alive, but something was wrong. She stood motionless, knee-deep in the river, staring at the far bank. Her clothes were filthy, torn. Her face was pale, her eyes vacant. She looked like she'd been awake for days. "Hannah," Chris called, starting toward her. She didn't react. He waded into the river, the cold water shocking against his legs. When he reached her, he touched her shoulder gently. She turned to look at him and her eyes were empty, as if she wasn't really seeing him. "He's coming," she whispered. "He's been feeding on me, taking little pieces every night. He showed me what happened, what my grandfather did to his village. He wants me to understand before he finishes." "We're getting you out of here," Chris said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You don't understand. You can't fight him. He's not alive. He's not dead. He's something in between." Movement on the far bank caught Chris's eye. There, standing in the shadow of the trees, was a figure. It looked like a man, tall, gaunt, dressed in rotted work clothes that might have been from the 1950s. But there was something wrong with its proportions, its movements. It swayed slightly as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. The figure raised one hand. Its fingers were too long, the joints bending in too many places. Chris felt something pulling at him, a compulsion to walk toward the figure, to wade across the river and join it in the shadows. He heard Tom shouting behind him, heard the other rangers calling, but their voices seemed distant, unimportant. All that mattered was reaching the figure, understanding what it wanted to show him. Then Sarah Reeves was beside him, grabbing his arm. "Chris, don't look at it. That's how it gets you. It makes you want to come." He tore his eyes away and the compulsion broke like a snapped thread. He grabbed Hannah and started pulling her back toward shore. She resisted at first, then seemed to collapse, becoming dead weight in his arms. Tom helped him drag her onto the bank while Sarah and the other rangers formed a line between them and the river. The figure on the far bank didn't cross the water. It just stood there, watching. Chris could see its face now, or what was left of it. The skin was gray and taut, the eyes sunken but still somehow aware. It looked like Eugene Dalka from the photograph, but twisted, emptied, sustained by something that wasn't life. "Fire," Sarah said suddenly. "The folklore says fire and iron, and you have to destroy the heart." Chris didn't question how she knew. He pulled out his radio. "We need the forensics team back at the gravesite. Now. And bring whatever they use to excavate. Shovels, picks, anything metal." They retreated from the river, carrying Hannah between them. The figure didn't follow, but Chris could feel it watching, feel its patience. It had waited 60 years. It could wait longer. Back at the gravesite, Dr. Cassidy was already there with her team. "The remains are gone," she said. "Everything from the chest cavity down is just missing, like something pulled itself out." "The heart," Chris said. Is the heart still there? I don't know. We'd have to search. Then search. Find it. Now. It took 20 minutes. They sifted through the disturbed earth around the grave, finding fragments of bone, scraps of clothing. And then Dr. Cassidy called out. She was holding something wrapped in rotted fabric. A dark, desiccated mass about the size of a fist. This is cardiac tissue, she said. Remarkably well preserved considering. But how did you know? We need to burn it, Chris said. And we need to do it now. The forensics team protested. This was evidence. It needed to be processed, documented. But Chris wasn't listening anymore. He took the heart from Dr. Cassidy, carried it to a clear area of forest floor, and built a fire. Tom helped him, neither of them speaking. Sarah found a metal stake left behind by the forensics team, one of their survey markers. When the fire was hot enough, Chris dropped the heart into the flames. It didn't burn like normal tissue. It writhed, seemed to pulse, and a sound emerged from it. A scream that might have been wind through the trees, or might have been something else entirely. The sound rose, became unbearable. Chris felt pressure in his head, behind his eyes. The forest seemed to darken even though it was midday. And then Sarah drove the metal stake down through the burning mass, pinning it to the earth. The scream cut off abruptly. The heart burned then, black smoke rising in a thin column. Chris watched it burn completely, making sure nothing remained. When it was done, when there was only ash, he scattered the ashes in the river and watched the current take them away. Hannah Doyle recovered slowly. She spent a week in Olympic Medical Center, being treated for dehydration exposure and what the doctors carefully termed acute dissociative episode. She had no memory of the days she'd been missing, only fragments, walking into the forest, feeling compelled to find something, dreams of a pale man who showed her scenes from a village she'd never visited. The official report classified her disappearance as temporary disorientation due to untreated medication interaction. It satisfied the administrators, closed the case, kept things neat. Chris filed it without protest. Some things couldn't be explained in official reports. But 3 weeks later, when he was reviewing the search records, preparing to archive them, he noticed something. The old newspaper article about Eugene Dalka, the one that had started him down this path, mentioned the names of the other men who'd participated in the vigilante hanging back in Romania. There had been 4 of them in total. Chris opened his computer and started searching. Immigration records, census data, obituaries. It took hours, but he found them. The other 3 men who'd killed Vasile Comenescu had all emigrated to the United States in the years after the war. One had settled in the Cascades near North Cascades National Park. He'd died in 1967. 3 hikers had vanished from that area since then, all in circumstances similar to the Ho disappearances. Another had moved to Montana near Glacier National Park. He died in 1973. 5 unsolved disappearances since then, all following the same pattern. The third had gone to Colorado, settling near Rocky Mountain National Park. Death in 1981. 7 disappearances since then. Chris sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. The pattern wasn't isolated to Olympic. It was replicated across the western United States. Wherever these men had fled, wherever they'd died, they'd all become what they'd feared, and they were all still taking victims, still trying to resolve something that could never be resolved. He thought about reporting it, about trying to warn someone, but who would believe him? He barely believed it himself, and he'd seen it. The evidence could be rationalized away, explained by coincidence and confirmation bias. The truth was too strange, too rooted in folklore that rational people had abandoned centuries ago. So Chris kept the information in a private file on his computer. He marked the locations on a map, tracked the patterns, and sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he wondered how many other places in the world had similar patterns, similar graves, similar things that had once been human and now existed in the spaces between life and death, sustained by stolen years and unfinished guilt. He thought about Eugene Dalka's daughter, Elena, who'd spent her whole life knowing what her father had become. He thought about Hannah Doyle, who would carry fragments of missing time for the rest of her life. He thought about all the other victims, scattered across decades who'd walked into forests and simply stopped existing because they'd crossed paths with something that shouldn't exist at all. The Hoh rainforest was quiet after that. The investigation was closed. The gravesite was filled in and marked with a discreet historical survey marker. The reports were filed, the evidence was cataloged, and everyone moved on. But Chris went back sometimes, hiking the trails alone. He'd stand near that bend in the river and remember what he'd seen. The figure in the shadows with two long fingers. The way it had pulled at him made him want to cross the water. He'd remember Hannah's vacant eyes and the sound the heart had made when it burned. The rational part of his mind, the analyst who'd spent 11 years tracking patterns and solving mysteries, still insisted there had to be a logical explanation. People disappeared because of mundane causes. Folklore was just stories. The dead stayed dead. But he'd seen the marks in the mud. He'd found the pattern in the data. He'd watched something burn that shouldn't have been able to burn. And sometimes when the fog rolled thick through the rainforest and the light failed early under the canopy, Chris would feel it. That same compulsion. That pull towards something in the shadows. A whisper that maybe he'd gotten it wrong. Maybe burning the heart hadn't been enough. Maybe Eugene Dalka was still out there, waiting with the patience of the dead for another descendant of Vasile Comanescu to wander into his forest. Chris would turn back then, returning to his truck, to his reports, to the comfortable lie of rational explanation. But the feeling would follow him, and he knew it always would. Because once you'd seen behind the pattern, once you'd glimpsed what actually lived in the spaces between the trees, you couldn't unsee it. The forest remembered. And the dead, it turned out, didn't forget. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The spot beacon alert came through at 3:47 p.m. on October 9, 2015, and Rob Miller was moving within 6 minutes. 28 years as a ranger at Glacier National Park had taught him that response time was everything in the high country, especially this late in the season when weather could turn a situation from bad to fatal in under an hour. Jessica Torres, 19 years old, solo hiker, 3-day permit for the Ptarmigan Tunnel backcountry area. Her beacon was pinging from 6,800 feet on the north face of Iceberg Peak, well above the maintained trails. The SOS signal showed critical emergency, not just a request for help. Rob had seen enough rescues to know the difference. His partner, Ken Yazzie, was down in Kalispell getting stitches after a run-in with a panicked elk, which meant Rob was heading up alone. He didn't mind. He'd done solo extractions before, knew these mountains better than the scars on his hands, and prided himself on being able to haul an injured hiker down from altitude faster than most teams half his age. At 52, Rob Miller was still the ranger they called when things got serious. He loaded his pack with the efficiency of muscle memory: medical trauma kit, litter components, climbing rope, carabiners, emergency bivy, extra layers, headlamp, batteries. His Garmin InReach satellite communicator went on his chest harness, fully charged. The departmental radio clipped to his shoulder. He'd already checked the weather service, clear until nightfall, then a front moving in from Canada that might bring the season's first serious snow. He had maybe 5 hours of good light. Rob's truck made it 3 miles up the fire road before the grade got too steep. He parked, shouldered the 65-pound pack without a grunt, and started hiking at the aggressive pace that had made him a legend among younger rangers who couldn't keep up. The Iceberg Lake Trail was familiar territory, a route he'd patrolled hundreds of times. 7 miles to the lake, then another brutal 2 miles of off-trail scrambling to reach Jessica's last known position. The forest at lower elevations showed the transition into autumn. Aspen gold against evergreen, huckleberry bushes gone red, the smell of dying leaves and cold soil. Rob's boots found their rhythm on the packed dirt trail, his breathing steady despite the climb. His knees ached like they always did these days, but he ignored them. Pain was just information, and Rob had learned long ago not to let information dictate action. At mile marker 3, he passed a group of day hikers heading down, their faces flushed from exertion. They recognized his uniform and stepped aside, one of them asking if everything was okay. Rob gave them the professional smile and the standard line. "Just a routine check. You folks have a good evening. No need to worry civilians about a possible rescue in progress. No need to mention the knot of unease that had been tightening in his gut since he'd seen Jessica's permit application 3 days ago. Solo hiker. First major backpacking trip. October in the high country. Rob had tried to warn her off when she'd filed the permit, suggested she wait until spring, maybe bring a partner. But she'd been polite and determined, showed him her gear list and her prepared route, promised she'd check in via her spot beacon daily. She'd seemed competent enough. They usually did. The trail steepened as he gained elevation, switchbacking through increasingly sparse timber. Rob checked his watch, 4:52 p.m., making good time. Another hour to the lake, then the hard part, scrambling up scree slopes and exposed ridge to reach Jessica's position. He pulled out his radio and keyed the transmit button. "Base, this is Miller. I'm at mile 5, estimate arrival at beacon location by 1900 hours. Weather's holding. Over." The response came back scratchy with distance. "Copy, Miller. Be advised, beacon signal has moved approximately 150 meters north-northeast in the last 40 minutes. Subject may be mobile. Over." Rob stopped walking. Jessica was moving. That could be good. Meant she wasn't incapacitated. Or it could be bad. Meant she was lost, disoriented, possibly hypothermic, and wandering. At 6,800 feet, with temperatures dropping toward freezing, wandering was a death sentence. "Copy that, base. Adjusting approach vector. Miller out." He picked up his pace, pushing through the fatigue that was starting to accumulate in his thighs. The trail broke out of the timber into alpine meadow country, and Rob got his first clear view of the high peaks. Iceberg Peak rose like a broken tooth against the sky, its north face still holding patches of last winter's snow, despite months of summer sun. The late afternoon light turned the rock faces orange and cast long shadows across the talus slopes. Beautiful and lethal, like everything in this country. The meadows were empty of wildlife. Rob noticed this with the part of his mind that automatically cataloged environmental details. No marmots whistling warnings, no pikas moving between rocks, no mountain goats on the cliffs above. The absence felt wrong, though he couldn't articulate why. Animals cleared out before storms sometimes, but the weather was still hours away. At Iceberg Lake, Rob paused only long enough to refill his water bottles and check his GPS. The lake sat in a cirque carved by glaciers, surrounded by 1,000-foot walls of stone. The water held that impossible turquoise color that came from glacial flour suspended in meltwater. Icebergs, actually chunks of avalanche debris, floated near the far shore despite the season. The place felt like the end of the world, beautiful and indifferent and ancient. Jessica's spot beacon showed 8 miles north-northeast, elevation 7,100 feet, straight up the mountain, through terrain that required hands as much as feet. Rob studied the slope, plotting his route through the scree fields and rock bands. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks. He had maybe 90 minutes before he'd need his headlamp. He started climbing. The scree was loose and treacherous, every step sliding backward 6 inches for every foot of forward progress. Rob used his trekking poles for balance, his breath coming harder now at altitude. His thighs burned. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the cold. This was the kind of terrain that destroyed ankles and knees, where one wrong step could send you tumbling down 1,000 feet of rock. Rob had extracted enough broken bodies from these slopes to know. At 6,400 feet, he found the first sign of Jessica Torres. A blue stuff sack lay wedged between 2 rocks, its contents spilled across the talus. Rob recognized it as a bare canister bag, the kind backpackers use to store food. He knelt and examined the scattered items, energy bars and torn wrappers, a plastic bag of trail mix with its contents scattered, a water bottle with teeth marks punched through the plastic. Teeth marks. Big ones. Rob pulled out his radio. "Base, this is Miller. I've found evidence of possible bear encounter at 6,400 feet. Food cache destroyed. Obvious signs of predation, advising grisly presence in area. Over. The response took longer this time. Copy, Miller. Do you want to abort and wait for backup? Rob looked up at the mountain. Jessica's beacon was still pinging from 700 feet above him. If she was injured, if she was bleeding, if she was going into shock, every minute mattered, and he'd handled bear situations before. Had his canister of bear spray on his chest harness, knew how to make noise, knew how to move through grisly country without triggering an attack. Negative, base. Continuing to subject location. Miller out. He stood and kept climbing, now making noise every 30 seconds, calling out, "Hey bear, coming through," and watching the rocks above for movement. The light was fading fast, the temperature dropping with it. Rob could see his breath now, little puffs of vapor that disappeared into the thin air. At 6,800 feet, he found Jessica's camp, or what was left of it. The tent had been shredded, not just damaged, completely destroyed, ripped into strips of fabric that fluttered from the rocks where they'd caught. The aluminum poles were bent into L shapes, snapped by force that made Rob reassess the situation. Grizzlies were strong, but this looked like something had attacked the tent with systematic violence. Jessica's sleeping bag lay 30 feet away, torn open, the down filling scattered across the rocks like snow. But there was no blood. Rob searched the area carefully, examining every rock and piece of equipment. No blood on the tent fabric, no blood on the sleeping bag, no blood pooled in the rocks. Whatever had happened here, Jessica hadn't been injured in the tent. Her spot beacon sat on a flat rock, still blinking its red SOS. The device was undamaged, which meant she'd activated it deliberately and then left it here. Why? Rob picked it up and checked the display. Battery at 73%. Signal strong. Last SOS sent 12 minutes ago. Fresh. Jessica, Rob's voice echoed off the rock faces. Jessica Torres, this is Park Service. Call out if you can hear me. The echo came back empty. No response. No sound except wind moving across stone. Rob turned in a slow circle, scanning the terrain. The campsite sat in a small depression surrounded by broken cliffs and talus fields. Limited visibility in all directions. He pulled out his headlamp and clicked it on. The sun had dropped behind the western peaks, and the light was failing fast. Shadows filled the spaces between rocks, turning every gap into a potential hiding spot. His radio crackled. Miller, this is base. We're showing the beacon signal stationary. Have you located the subject? Negative. I found her campsite. Evidence of severe bear damage, but no sign of the hiker. No blood, no... Base, this doesn't track right. I'm going to do a radius search. Copy. Be advised, weather front has accelerated. Snow expected within 2 hours. Rob checked the sky. The clouds were building from the north, piling up against the mountains in a wall of gray-black that promised serious weather. He needed to find Jessica fast. If she was injured and exposed, she wouldn't survive a night of October snow at 7,000 feet. Jessica, he called again louder. If you can hear me, stay where you are. I'm here to help. Make noise. And then, from somewhere above him in the rocks, he heard her voice. Help, please, I'm up here. Rob's head snapped toward the sound. It had come from maybe 100 feet above, from a band of cliffs that rose into the gathering darkness. He couldn't see anyone, but the voice had been clear. Young, frightened. Jessica, keep talking, I'm coming to you. Hurry, please hurry, it's following me. Rob started scrambling up the slope, using his hands to pull himself over boulders, his headlamp beam bouncing crazily across the rocks. Adrenaline pushed back the fatigue. If she was mobile and talking, she wasn't critical. And if something was following her, bear, mountain lion, whatever, his presence would scare it off. Animals feared humans. Animals ran from noise and light. Keep talking, Jessica. I need to hear your voice. I'm scared. I can't, please. It won't leave me alone. Her voice was coming from higher up, maybe 7,200 feet now. Rob climbed faster, his breath ragged, his legs screaming. The rocks were loose under his boots. Twice he nearly fell, catching himself at the last second. His radio slipped from his shoulder and clattered down the slope, disappearing into the darkness below. Didn't matter. He'd get Jessica, get her down to the lower campsite, call for helicopter extraction at first light. "I'm almost there. Just keep..." Rob stopped. Jessica's spot beacon was still in his hand. He could feel it, solid and real, blinking against his palm. He'd picked it up from her campsite. It was here, with him. But Jessica's voice was calling from above. The rational part of Rob's mind, the part that had kept him alive through 28 years of mountain rescues, locked down hard on this contradiction. Spot beacons were mandatory for solo hikers. If Jessica had activated her emergency beacon and then left it behind, she would have said so, would have told him she'd dropped it, lost it, something. But the voice calling from above was asking for help, was claiming to be running from something, wasn't mentioning the beacon at all. Rob clicked off his headlamp. In the sudden darkness, his eyes adjusted slowly. The stars were starting to emerge between gaps in the clouds. And in that starlight, Rob saw something moving on the cliff above him. It was tall. Too tall. Probably 7 feet, maybe more, though the angle and distance made it hard to judge. And it was thin, impossibly thin, like something that had been starved until only bones remained inside loose skin. It moved with a stuttering, jerking motion as if its joints worked in directions joints shouldn't work. And as Rob watched, frozen, his hand tightening around the spot beacon, the thing opened its mouth. "Help! Please! I'm up here!" Jessica's voice came from the thing's mouth, perfect in tone and inflection, exactly as he'd heard it before. Rob's training fractured. Everything he knew about wildlife behavior, about rescue operations, about how the natural world worked, all of it collided with sensory input his brain couldn't process. The thing wasn't human, wasn't a bear, wasn't any animal he could name. It was something else. Something his rational mind rejected even as his eyes confirmed it was real. The creature tilted its head, that same wrong, mechanical movement, and made another sound. This time it was his own voice. "Jessica, keep talking, I'm coming to you." His voice. Perfect. Every inflection, every tone, played back like a recording but coming from that thing's mouth. Rob did what 28 years of experience had taught him to do. He ran. Not down the mountain. Down was where his radio had fallen. Down was where he'd have to navigate in darkness through unstable talus. Instead, he ran laterally, scrambling across the slope toward a band of cliffs he remembered from his ascent. There were caves there, small ones, places a human could wedge into that something 7 feet tall couldn't follow. His headlamp stayed off. Darkness was his ally now. Darkness hid him. Behind him he heard sounds. Not footsteps, not animal pursuit. A scraping, scratching noise like antlers against bark or bones against stone, moving fast, impossibly fast across terrain that had taken Rob hours to climb. And then Jessica's voice again, closer. "I'm scared. I can't. Please, it won't leave me alone." The cave mouth appeared in his headlamp beam. He'd turned it back on for just a second to locate it, and Rob dove inside. The opening was maybe 3 feet wide, 2 feet tall. He had to crawl. The space inside was larger, enough to sit up in, but the entrance was the bottleneck. Nothing large could get through easily. Rob wedged himself into the back of the cave, pressing against cold stone, his chest heaving. He fumbled for his bear spray, got it in his right hand with his thumb on the trigger. His left hand still clutched Jessica's spot beacon. The light from its blinking LED cast red flashes across the cave walls. Outside, the scraping sound stopped. Rob held his breath, listened, heard his own pulse thundering in his ears, heard wind across rock, heard nothing else. Then he heard breathing. It came from just outside the cave entrance, a wet, rattling sound like air moving through a throat full of fluid. In, out, regular and patient, waiting. Rob's hand shook. The bear spray would work at close range, 16 feet, 2-second burst, enough capsaicin to stop a grizzly charge. But this wasn't a grizzly. This was something else, something that mimicked voices, something that moved like a broken puppet, something that shouldn't exist. The breathing stopped. A hand reached into the cave entrance. Rob's headlamp beam caught it for just a second before he clicked the light off in pure instinct. But that second was enough. The hand, if it was a hand, had fingers too long, too thin, ending in black nails or claws that scraped against stone. The skin was gray-white, stretched tight over bones that were visible beneath it. And it was reaching, searching, fingers flexing and extending like a spider's legs, feeling for him in the darkness. Rob pressed harder against the back wall. The cave was maybe 6 feet deep. The hand was already 3 feet inside. Those fingers could touch him if they extended another 3 feet. And they were extending, impossibly telescoping, joints bending in the wrong directions. He sprayed. The bear spray erupted from the canister in a thick orange cloud, filling the small cave entrance. Rob heard something recoil, heard a sound that might have been pain, or surprise or anger, a high keening that made his teeth ache. The hand withdrew, fast, scraping against rock hard enough to leave marks. Then silence. Rob waited. 5 minutes. 10. The bear spray dissipated slowly in the still air, making his own eyes water even from the back of the cave. He didn't move, didn't breathe loudly. Just waited, bear spray canister ready, every nerve screaming. After 20 minutes, he risked turning on his headlamp. The cave entrance was empty. No hand, no creature, just the opening, and beyond it the darkness of the mountain night. Rob could see stars now between the clouds. The temperature had dropped further. He could see frost forming on the rocks near the cave mouth. His radio was gone, dropped somewhere on the slope below. His spot beacon, Jessica's beacon, was still in his hand. He could activate it, send his own SOS, but that would bring other rangers up the mountain. Would bring Ken or Rachel or one of the younger guys, would bring them into the range of whatever that thing was. The thing that mimicked voices, the thing that moved wrong, the thing that had destroyed Jessica's camp and done something to Jessica herself. Jessica. Rob's mind, still trying to maintain some framework of rationality, went to the worst conclusion. She was dead. That thing had killed her, had learned her voice the way it had learned his, was using her voice to lure others, had probably used other voices before. How many missing hikers over the years? How many unexplained disappearances in the high country, written off as falls or bear attacks or simply vanished without a trace? Rob had studied park history, knew the numbers. In the summer of 1967, 3 hikers had disappeared in this exact area. The Lost Creek Expedition, they'd called it, though this wasn't near Lost Creek. The Park Service had searched for 2 weeks, found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no sign of what had happened. The case had gone cold, and eventually been attributed to a combination of bad weather and poor judgment. But what if it hadn't been weather? What if something else had found them? The thought opened doors in Rob's mind he desperately wanted to keep closed. Because if something was up here, something that killed hikers, something that had been killing hikers for at least 48 years, then everything he knew about these mountains was a lie. Every time he'd told families that their loved ones had fallen or gotten lost or succumbed to exposure, had he been wrong? Had something been hunting them? A sound echoed across the rocks. Rob's head turned toward the cave entrance, his hand tightening on the bear spray. The sound came again, clearer this time. Singing. Not words. Not any language Rob recognized. Just a melody, high and wordless, rising and falling in patterns that hurt something deep in his brain. The kind of sound that felt old, primordial, like it came from a time before humans had language. And underneath the melody, Rob heard other things. Wind, but not wind. Movement, but not footsteps. The sense of something large circling his position, patient, waiting for him to make a mistake. He checked his watch. 7:23 p.m. The front was due to hit within the hour. Once the snow started, visibility would drop to nothing. Temperature would plummet. He had maybe 40 minutes to make a decision. Stay in the cave and hope the thing lost interest, or make a run for lower elevation in the last remaining visibility. Staying meant surviving the night in a cave at 7,000 feet without a sleeping bag, without insulation, in temperatures that would drop below 20 degrees. Possible, but miserable and dangerous. Running meant exposing himself on open talus in darkness, meant descending through grizzly country, meant moving when that thing could be anywhere. Rob had spent 28 years telling people to stay put when lost. Don't wander, don't panic, wait for rescue. But rescue wasn't coming. Nobody knew he was in trouble. His radio was gone. If he activated the spot beacon, the response team wouldn't arrive until morning at the earliest, and by then, he might be dead from exposure or dead from whatever was out there. The singing stopped. In the silence that followed, Rob heard scraping again. Close, right outside the cave, or just above it. The creature was still there, still waiting. And Rob realized something that made his stomach drop. It knew he was trapped. It had learned patience over decades, maybe longer. It could wait, could starve him out, could keep him pinned in this cave until hypothermia or dehydration made him weak enough to take easily. His headlamp battery was at 60%. His phone, he checked it reflexively, showed no signal and 23% battery. He had one full water bottle, no food. And he'd burned his only real weapon, the bear spray, in that first panicked encounter. Rob Miller, veteran ranger, expert mountaineer, man who had saved 43 lives over his career, was going to die in a cave at 7,000 feet while something inhuman waited outside. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. But then, through the cave entrance, he saw snow starting to fall. Light flakes at first, then heavier, accumulating fast the way early season storms did in Glacier. Within 5 minutes, visibility outside the cave dropped to less than 20 feet. The wind picked up, howling across the rocks. Temperature plummeted. Rob could feel it even in the shelter of the cave, could feel his fingers starting to go numb despite his gloves. The storm was his chance. The thing outside was adapted to these mountains, but it relied on sight and sound to hunt. If Rob could move fast enough, stay quiet enough, navigate by dead reckoning and GPS through the storm, he might make it down before the creature could track him. It was a terrible plan. Storm descent in darkness through technical terrain was a violation of every safety protocol. But the alternative was dying in this cave, and Rob Miller had not survived 28 years in these mountains by choosing the safe option when safe meant death. He stuffed the spot beacon into his jacket pocket, clicked off his headlamp to preserve battery, and crawled toward the cave entrance. Snow was already accumulating on the rocks, covering the landscape in white. The wind drowned out most other sounds. No singing, no scraping, just the roar of storm. Rob emerged from the cave low and fast, already moving downslope before his eyes could fully adjust. He used his hands as much as his feet, scrambling over snow-slick rocks, following the general downward slope. His GPS unit showed his position as a blue dot against terrain lines, but the screen was hard to read in the blowing snow. He aimed for lower elevation, for the tree line he knew was somewhere below, for anything that wasn't this exposed alpine hell. A shape moved in the storm to his left. Rob changed direction without thinking, veering right, his boots slipping on ice-glazed rock. His knee hit stone hard enough to send pain shooting up his leg. He ignored it, kept moving, half running, half falling down the mountain. The shape paced him. He could see it in his peripheral vision. A darker darkness in the storm. 7 feet tall and moving with that stuttering, impossible gait. It was faster than him on this terrain. Faster than anything should be. But it wasn't attacking. Not yet. It was hurting him, Rob realized. Pushing him in a specific direction, away from the route he'd climbed up, toward something else. Rob planted his feet and changed direction hard, cutting back the way he'd come even though it meant moving upgrade briefly. The shape altered course to follow, but Rob had gained 20 feet of separation. He used it, scrambling over a boulder field that he never would have attempted in daylight, relying on luck and momentum and 28 years of mountain experience that told him how to read terrain even when he couldn't see it. His boot caught on something and he went down hard, rolling, his pack slamming into his spine. He slid 15 feet down a scree slope and fetched up against a rock outcrop that knocked the air from his lungs. For a moment, he couldn't move. couldn't breathe, could only lie in the snow trying to remember how to make his diaphragm work. The shape appeared at the top of the slope. Rob could see it clearly now despite the storm, backlit by some quality of the snow that made dark things stand out against white. It was emaciated, impossibly thin, its ribcage visible through skin that looked like leather stretched over bones. Its arms hung too long at its sides. Its head, Rob's mind tried to reject what he was seeing, tried to make it make sense, but couldn't. The head was crowned with antlers, massive ones, elk or moose, but wrong, growing from the skull in ways that antlers didn't grow. And its eyes reflected the snowlight like an animal's eyes, except they were the wrong color, a yellow-green that didn't exist in nature. This was what had killed Jessica Torres, had killed the Lost Creek expedition in 1967, had probably killed others, over years, over decades, luring them with familiar voices, herding them into places where they couldn't escape, taking them one by one in the high country where nobody would find the bodies until they were scattered bones among scattered rocks. The creature opened its mouth and spoke with Rob's dead wife's voice. "Rob, come home. I miss you. Come home." Sarah had died 3 years ago. Cancer. Rob had held her hand in the hospital while she slipped away, had heard her last words, had carried that memory every day since. And now this thing, this impossible thing, was using her voice, was reaching into Rob's memory somehow, finding the sounds that would hurt the most, that would freeze him with grief and longing. Something broke in Rob Miller, not fear. He was already afraid, had been afraid since the moment he'd heard Jessica's voice coming from that antlered thing, not hope. He'd abandoned hope when he realized what he was facing. What broke was his attachment to living. Sarah was dead. His career was ending, his knees were shot, his back was failing. The younger Rangers were already faster and stronger. His daughter lived in Seattle and called twice a year. What exactly did he have to survive for? And once that calculation hit zero, Rob Miller stopped running. He stood up in the snow, facing the creature, and pulled out his knife. 6 inches of carbon steel, designed for cutting rope and processing firewood. Useless against something that size, that strength. But it was something. And if he was going to die on this mountain, he would die fighting, not running, not cowering in a cave waiting for the end. "Come on then," Rob said. His voice was steady. "Let's finish this." The creature tilted its head, that wrong, mechanical movement. Then it came down the slope. Fast. Faster than Rob's eyes could track. One moment it was 50 feet away. The next it was on him and Rob was swinging the knife. Felt it connect with something solid. Felt resistance and then blood. Black blood, thick like oil, spraying across the white snow. The creature recoiled, making that high, keening sound again. Rob pressed forward, slashing again, aiming for the throat, for anything vital. His knife connected twice more, opening wounds that bled black across gray skin. But the creature didn't slow, didn't fall. It grabbed Rob's arm. The hand around his wrist was cold, so cold it burned, and lifted him off the ground. Rob hung in the air, his boots kicking uselessly, his knife still clenched in his trapped hand. The creature brought him close to its face, and Rob saw details he would have paid any price not to see. The skin was covered in old scars, hundreds of them, crisscrossing in patterns that might have been ritual markings. The teeth were human once, but worn down to points, stained dark. The eyes had intelligence in them, malevolent and ancient and hungry. And then the creature spoke in a voice that was its own, not mimicked, not stolen. "Wichtigo. I am Wichtigo. I am the hunger that does not end. I was a man. I ate of man. Now I am this. Forever." The words were in English, but Rob understood them in a way that transcended language. This thing had been human once, had crossed a taboo so fundamental that it had transformed into something else. And in that transformation, it had become tied to these mountains, to the high country, to the places where humans came to test themselves against nature, and found instead something older than nature. The creature opened its mouth wide. Rob saw the throat beyond, saw darkness deeper than any cave, saw what waited for him if those jaws closed. He swung his knife one more time, blindly, desperately, and by pure luck struck the creature's wrist. The black blood sprayed across Rob's face, burning where it touched skin. The creature dropped him. Rob hit the snow and rolled, came up running, no longer caring about direction or strategy, just moving downslope, stumbling, falling, getting up, falling again. Behind him, the screaming started. Not his voice this time, not Sarah's. A sound that was purely inhuman, rage and pain and hunger mixed into something that made the storm winds seem quiet by comparison. Rob could hear it pursuing now. No longer subtle, no longer patient, just coming, fast and direct. The trees appeared out of the storm like salvation. Rob crashed into the tree line at full speed, branches whipping his face, his boots finding purchase in needles and soil instead of rock and ice. The forest meant cover, meant places to hide, meant... He stopped. He was standing in a clearing, a small one, maybe 40 feet across. And around the edges of that clearing, he saw markers, not flags or signs. Bones. Arranged in careful patterns, some old enough to be brown and weathered, some new enough to still have tissue clinging to them. Human bones. Dozens of sets, maybe hundreds. Rob had found its killing ground. And in the center of the clearing stood a cairn made from skulls. The screaming stopped. In the sudden silence, Rob could hear his own breathing, ragged and desperate. Could hear the snow falling through branches. Could hear behind him the sound of something large moving through the forest, circling, surrounding. His hand found Jessica's spot beacon in his pocket. The device was still blinking, still pinging its SOS into the void. Rob pulled it out, looked at the single button that would send his own emergency signal. Backup would come, eventually, but they would come to this clearing, to this bone garden, and they would find what he'd found. Or they would become part of it. Rob Miller made his last decision as a ranger. He turned off the beacon. Nobody else needed to come up this mountain. Nobody else needed to face what he'd faced. The Park Service could mark Jessica Torres as lost, could close this area, could declare it too dangerous for access. The Wetigo. Rob's mind finally accepted the word, accepted what it meant, would stay in its territory, would wait for the next person who climbed too high, ventured too far, ignored the warnings that mountain people had been passing down for generations. The creature emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing. It moved slowly now, deliberately, no longer rushing. Rob watched it approach, his knife still in his hand even though he knew it was useless. The thing had survived his attacks, had probably survived worse over the decades. Knives didn't kill hunger given form. Nothing killed hunger. Rob thought of Sarah, thought of his daughter, thought of the 43 people he'd saved over his career, the lives that had continued because of his skill and his courage and his refusal to accept that mountains were stronger than human will. He'd been wrong about that last part. The Wetigo reached for him with those two long fingers. Rob didn't run. There was nowhere left to run. The creature's hand closed around his throat, cold burning through skin, and Rob Miller, veteran ranger, expert mountaineer, man who had saved 43 lives, became number 44 in a different count. The thing that had been human once, that had eaten of human flesh and become something else, carried Rob Miller deeper into its territory. The snow continued to fall, covering tracks, covering bones, covering the evidence that anything had ever happened in these mountains, except the slow turn of seasons and the patient hunger of things that waited in the high country. 3 days later, a helicopter search team found Rob Miller's truck parked at the fire road. They found his planned route on his GPS at the station. They found nothing else. No tracks, no equipment, no sign of where he'd gone. The storm had obliterated everything. Jessica Torres remained missing. Rob Miller was added to the list. The official report cited severe weather conditions, possible avalanche, treacherous terrain. The area around Iceberg Peak was temporarily closed to backcountry travel. Eventually it would reopen. People would come. Some would climb too high, venture too far, and the Wetigo would be waiting, patient as stone, hungry as winter, using voices of the lost to call the living into darkness. Because some things that are created cannot be destroyed. Some hungers cannot be satisfied. And some places in the mountains belong to presences that were ancient when the glaciers carved these valleys, and will remain long after the glaciers return. The forest keeps its secrets, the high country keeps its dead, and in the bone clearing beneath Iceberg Peak, among the arranged skulls and scattered ribs, 2 more skeletons slowly weathered into the soil, becoming part of the mountain, becoming forgotten, becoming just another story that rangers tell to explain why some people never come home from the wilderness. Ken Yazzie, Rob's partner, retired 6 months later. He couldn't explain why, just said he'd lost his taste for the high country, said the mountains felt different now, said sometimes late at night he heard his friend's voice calling from outside his window, asking for help, asking him to come find him. He never did. Some calls he decided should not be answered. And in Glacier National Park, when October comes and the first snows dust the peaks, the rangers tell each other to stay below treeline. They don't say why, don't need to. They've all heard the stories, some old, some new, all ending the same way. The mountains are beautiful, the mountains are deadly, and sometimes the mountains are hungry. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.